Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 308. This is of course the end of July Patreon Drydock, so there are going to be two parts and there's going to be a lot of questions answered. So buckle in and, well, let's get on with answering those questions. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns asks. The battlecruiser HMS Queen Mary had 42 boilers to power her turbines rated for 75,000 shaft horsepower using a mix of coal and oil, while the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships had 24 boilers to power their turbines, also rated for 75,000 shaft horsepower, using only oil. How did the use of only fuel oil instead of coal or a mixture of both achieve such a drastic drop in the number of boilers needed to produce the same power, despite the same boiler pressure of 235 psi? Or was the change of fuel only a part of other technologies used to achieve this? The change in fuel is a small part of the explanation because oil provides 30 to 40% more power per kilo or per ton, I suppose, when you're talking about capital ships, when it's burned. Therefore, in theory, fewer boilers can put out the same amount of power overall. But the single largest contribution at this stage, when you talk about Queen Mary going over to the Queen Elizabeth class, or indeed Iron Dukes to the Queen Elizabeth or whatever, is the nature of oil versus coal. If you have a coal-fired boiler, then the size of that boiler is ultimately going to be limited by the fact that a stoker can only shovel coal so far into a boiler. Now, yes, if you take a good swing at it, you can get the coal to go further, but remember, stokers also have to clean out the boiler of ash and clinker and so forth, and very often in battle conditions, and indeed in general cruising, that has to be done while the boiler is still hot, so you can't wait for it to cool down and crawl inside, and this means that the depth of the boiler is regulated by essentially how far can you chuck coal and how far can you reach in and scrape out the remains. With oil, that's not a concern. Therefore, you can make an oil boiler, an oil-fired boiler, considerably deeper and commensurately larger in other dimensions as well, which is more efficient because, of course, square cube law, you increase the linear dimensions by a certain amount, you're massively increasing the internal volume, which means you can get more tubes in, which means you can transmit more power on top of the additional power output of the oil in the first place. So, yes, the switch from the coal to oil helps in terms of oil providing more energy, but the single biggest impact is the fact you don't have to worry about stokers and their physical limitations anymore. Brian Stevens asks, what would you say are the advances in technology that moved ships into what we think of today as the age of sail? Well, you've got a couple of options there because, of course, you have what I sometimes call on the channel the classic age of sail, which is, if you say age of sail, what most people will immediately think of, which is the late 17th and 18th centuries. So, you know, the era of Nelson, the Napoleonic Wars towards the end of that period, and going back through, you know, the big line of battle conflicts, perhaps starting with the Anglo-Dutch Wars. But in actual terms, the full age of sail starts in the middle of the 16th century, sort of 1530s, 1540s, and goes forward, at least according to most definitions. I mean, there is a little bit of play there. And the useful thing is that period actually does provide a certain degree of technological change that we can see. Whereas if you look at, you know, what is the technological change between, let's say, the beginning of the 17th century to the middle of it, and then to the end of it, well, there's not really a huge amount of technological change, just iteration. So if we're looking at the very beginning of the actual age of sail, then, well, the reason Mary Rose is featuring on your screens right now is because she's actually a very good example. She's just this side of the beginnings of what would be considered the proper age of sail. And I think the single largest technological change was the switch from clinker to carvel building in at least Northern Europe. There are other building methods like mortise and tenon, which have been used in older periods, say in the Mediterranean, dowel and joint, that kind of stuff. But for the sudden uptick in shipping from, a cog or a hulk or something like that in the medieval period to something like Mary Rose, or even ships larger than her, and then you start to see, obviously, these ships going out and exploring everywhere and moving considerably longer distances. That switch from the clinker to carvel build is key. Now, the reason that's key is because it goes hand in hand with the ability of ships to carry guns, which suddenly makes them a whole lot more dangerous than, to sail up and board somebody. And it also enables a whole slew of other things because it allows the ships to be bigger and stronger, which means you can fit more masts. And therefore, if you can fit more masts, it allows you to adopt different masts. Like you can see here, you've got on the aft two masts there, you've got fore and aft masts, lateen sail types. And it makes it more practical to have a central rudder rather than steering oars, although that is a kind of separate innovation in and of itself. And the reason for all this is that with clinker building, you build the keel of the ship, but then you put overlapping planks. So one plank overlaps the other all the way around to build up the hull of the vessel. Now, you will have frames, but the frames are there essentially to dictate the overall shape of the vessel and give you something to nail the planks to. The frames in and of themselves are not particularly structural. The strength of the vessel comes from the hull. This is great on a small scale. I mean, look at Viking longships. They are very classic clinker-built vessels. But the hull flexes and therefore has certain limitations as to overall size. And also because the hull is the structural member of the ship, one, it means if your hull takes significant damage, your entire ship can end up collapsing, which happens to a number of galleys at Lepanto, for example. Some older vessels, they're fairly lightly built, but still, even a clinker-built ship that's a bit larger, if it runs aground and the side is split open, that could lead very rapidly to the complete structural collapse of the vessel. And again, because the structural loading is carried by the hull, it means that you don't have very strong decks, which hinders your ability to mount heavy loads like guns, because if the hull is flexible and also your main structure, then the only way that you can have a strong deck is to fix big heavy timbers to your hull planking, and then when the hull flexes, you have the chance of your deck warping or dropping out and all sorts of bad things happening. Conversely, with carvel building, this is what we're probably much more used to. You have your keel, and then you have much more frequent, much heavier framework, building up almost like a rib cage, and that is the structural element of the ship. That is what keeps the ship together. The planking that then goes on the outside, while obviously it does provide a degree of rigidity and strength, is mostly there to keep the water out. So you can replace that planking pretty easily as it rots out or gets damaged. And if that planking starts to split, come apart from each other, or you run aground or you take battle damage, it's far easier to repair, and you are much less likely to endure massive structural collapse due to some exterior damage to your hull. So this makes ships stronger, because now obviously you can mount the decks to your big strong ribs and frames, which means you can mount guns, and because the whole ship is stronger generally, that means the ships can get larger, and all of a sudden you see an explosion of ship construction at the upper end of things, because the size of a ship within reason is now no longer really limited by your construction materials. It's more limited by the size of your dockyards and how much money people are willing to pay for a ship. So while even by the time of the Spanish Armada, a lot of ships, especially in the English fleet, are double-digit to low triple-digit tonnages, There are ships in the upper triple digits and even the low thousands of tons, and obviously considerably more in that range in the Armada itself, simply because if you wanted a, let's say, 600, 800-ton race-built galleon in the Elizabethan period, if you had the money, there was nothing technologically stopping anyone from building it. Whereas if you try and build a 800-ton displacement as opposed to ton burthen clinker-built vessel, you're going to have fun with that. Nicholas Rassar asks, turboelectric drives died during the treaty era because they were heavier than geared turbines, but in the absence of the naval treaties, would they still have fallen out of favour due to their weight, or are there enough positives that they would see some new builds? There are a great many potential positives with the use of turboelectric drive, but there are three main negatives that you have to consider to decide whether or not those are acceptable, or can you try and work to partially overcome them, which would then in either case dictate that you would try and use them, other than considering positives of either one. The other thing you've got to remember is that the turboelectric drive was originally developed as an alternative to direct drive turbines. Once geared turbines come into the picture, the argument for turboelectric starts to die off to a certain degree. There are still advantages of turboelectric drive versus geared turbines, but there are far fewer of them as compared to against direct drive turbines. But the three negatives, the three biggest negatives, I suppose, are firstly weight and space, because a turboelectric drivetrain consists of a boiler, a turbine, or multiple boilers feeding a turbine, which feeds a generator, which feeds a motor, which then turns the propeller. And obviously, if you have a big ship, you have multiple of these, as you can see. Whereas in a turbine setup, whether it be geared or direct drive, you have a boiler and then a turbine, and then possibly some gearing, and that goes to the propeller. So you're involving two additional steps, which technically also makes a turboelectric drive more energy inefficient because you have to convert energy more times, although that's offset by the fact that the turbines are able to run on their most efficient setting all the time, as opposed to with direct drive or geared turbines, where sometimes you have to run the turbines at inefficient settings. But nonetheless, anyway, so weight and space are the two big issues, because of course you've got the additional weight of those are two additional components, and of course you've got to find somewhere to put those components. The final remaining one, which is sometimes discussed, although sometimes not, is a little bit of a niche case, but still quite an important one, and that is in case of fairly catastrophic damage ranging from astern to amidships, i.e. major flooding that's defeated a torpedo defense system, a turboelectric drive system is, in theory, considerably more vulnerable than a turbine, direct drive or geared turbine system. And that is simply because, of course, electricity and water do not mix. Now, of course, yes, the generators and the electric motors would be insulated, but if you want to say that any electrical insulation is perfect in a seawater environment, I have a bridge to sell you. And, of course, if we're talking about something as catastrophic as a torpedo or potentially a diving shell has breached into the machinery compartments, there's probably a lot of water and debris and shrapnel flying around, which will potentially compromise insulation. And, at best that shorts out the system, or part of the system. At worst, it also shorts out people who were around. Whereas with more conventional propulsion, the actual propeller shafts and the turbines, bearing in mind the turbines are encased, can actually run perfectly well underwater. I mean, it's not ideal, but they will still function. It's only the boilers that are vulnerable immediately to being flooded. Now, you might say, well, some navies will probably reckon if you've got massive flooding in your machinery spaces, you've probably got a bigger problem anyway, and of course, turboelectric drive can be better compartmentalized. So, okay, let's say we can justify ignoring that first one. But what about the space and weight issues? Well, it's not just about treaty weight limits, it's about the overall shape and size and therefore cost of the design. If you can have a ship with geared turbines that you can get at, let's say, 3,000 tons less and considerably less internal volume used up by your machinery, well, that means you can either have more ships for the same money, or you can put that, if you're going to spend the same money on the same number of ships, you can put that displacement that you're saving towards guns and armor, and therefore make your ship more effective in battle, and therefore less likely to have to worry about, compartmentalization and flooding and all these other resiliency things that turboelectric drive offers. And when you look at, say, the retrofits of some of the older ships in the Second World War, and you look at how much more internal volume low down had to be taken up by anti-aircraft gun magazines, whether that be 20mm, 40mm, 4-inch, 5-inch, whatever. All of that, obviously, those magazine spaces require hull volume. Often secondary battery magazines were used, but other compartments were also converted. And so on a geared turbine vessel, assuming that you build a geared turbine on a turboelectric drive vessel to approximately the same dimensions, for sake of argument, you will have more space available low down for anti-aircraft defense in, say, the 30s and 40s than you will with a turboelectric driven vessel. And that may very well tip the balance, all other things aside, especially when it comes to designing theoretically unlimited capacity fast battleships, because you still have cost and shipyard limitations to contend with overall. And you might be able to turn around and say, well, if you want a 28 knot fast battleship with 12 inches of inclined armor and 9 16-inch guns, then yeah, sure, we can do that for this tonnage, let's say 40,000 tons to be comfortable, using geared turbines. And we can put tons of anti-aircraft on it because there's loads of space available for the magazines. But if we want the same ship with the same capability, especially with the same anti-aircraft armor, and we're using a turbo-electric drive, well, we're going to have to add another 3,000 tons and slightly increase the dimensions to find the space down there for more magazines. So once the geared turbine comes in, and once that is becoming a mature and refined technology, the disadvantages of the turboelectric drive as you would go on through the interwar period, assuming no regulations, would become more and more pronounced. It doesn't take away some of the inherent advantages of turboelectric drive, but it does perhaps mitigate them somewhat. The Judge 2017 asks, what letter grade, A, B, C, D, or F, do the major navies of World War II receive on a report card? Obviously, comparing the Kriegsmarine to the Royal Navy like for like isn't fair, but they had very different goals. I think grading them on these goals could be the best metric for grading the effectiveness of their respective navies. I think that's going to be quite difficult, to be honest, for the entire war, because even if you're grading them simply by how are they best achieving their goals rather than, relative strength and stuff like that, which I think is actually, going by their goals is a good metric. The navies across the board are doing better at achieving their goals in some years and considerably less well in other years. And then how do you average that out? And, ultimately, how else do you grade things? Because, at the end of the day, a navy's objective ultimately is to help its country win a war. So does that mean that we give the Italian, German, and Japanese navies all Fs because, spoiler alert, they lost? Or do we, just look at their objective in isolation, perhaps ignoring what's going on the home front, so to speak? And then, how fair is that? Because admittedly, looking at the Kriegsmarine in isolation is easier because obviously most of the war against Germany was going on land, on the eastern and western fronts, albeit, the Kriegsmarine does have some opportunity to influence that, trying to stop the D-Day landings, as hopeless as that would be, for example. Whereas for Italy, it's perhaps, half and half. You do have the campaign in the desert and the campaign on mainland Italy, but you go from the desert of North Africa to mainland Italy via Sicily using naval power. And then, of course, with Japan, most of the war is a naval war with battles on islands as the navies tussle and fight, and therefore one side or the other gets access to particular islands to try and invade or support. Although overall I do like this idea, at least based on, British style school report cards, at least at the period that I did them. So maybe at some point in the future I'll come up with a whole set of, again, British school style, because that's the one I know, style report cards, maybe based on per year for each navy, and see if people want some copies of those. If we're going to go and say, okay, we're going to just give a single grade for the entire war for each navy. Okay. This is probably going to be a little bit controversial for each one, to be honest, but I will try and explain in brief my reasoning for each. The US Navy, which this might come as a bit of a shock to some people, I would give it a B+-A-, merging more maybe towards a B+. I would not give it a straight A, simply because whilst, yes, towards the end of its involvement in World War II, the US Navy was this massive juggernaut that was just pulverizing the Imperial Japanese Navy left, right, and centre, the simple fact is that, as a number of US admirals at the time noted, the US Navy, despite having, most of the rest of World War II going on for a couple of years before Pearl Harbor, fundamentally was not ready for war on December 7th, 1941. And I'm not just talking about the fact that Pearl Harbor itself wasn't ready, as was demonstrated by a whole range of things, from fighter control direction to anti-aircraft fire to night fighting tactics to the efficiency of carrier launches to a whole laundry list of other things, or more accurately perhaps the lack of those things. The US Navy in late 41, early mid 42, and arguably even towards the end of 42 in some respects, was very lacking. So, a report card for the US Navy in 1942 would mostly be very negative, with a few bright spots, like Midway, rather important one, but still. But even then, when you break Midway down, there's a lot of stuff to criticize as well as a lot of stuff to praise. And then, of course, things get better and better as people figure out tactics, technology improves, numbers improve, etc., etc. So, as an overall score, it would be, as I say, B+A-, and kind of the teacher's note at the bottom would be something like, started off pretty poorly, wasn't really paying attention, but began to learn very quickly and soon came to dominate the rest of their classmates. So, good future prospects, but needs to be quicker on the uptake. The Royal Navy, I'm also round about the same boat, maybe probably, again, it's B+, A-, trending maybe towards a B+, mostly on the grounds that, well, the two big negatives that would drag it down is, firstly, the somewhat comically, hilariously terrible incidents and tactics in the early part of the war, like using a fleet carrier with 2 destroyers to try and hunt submarines. Shockingly enough, the submarines won that round, and they're down with HMS Courageous. And the other big one, of course, would be, yes, well done, you tried to fight everybody on the planet, which is a very British thing to do, but with a navy that was nowhere near ready or prepared enough in terms of numbers and size. Now, that is something of a political failing as well, but essentially the Royal Navy, more by circumstance than design, ended up fighting a war that was even more widespread than the one they'd fought in the First World War, with a navy that was significantly smaller than the one that they'd fought the First World War with, and the First World War stretched the Grand Fleet and Company to the max. And as a result, a lot of stuff that happened that was pretty bad for the Royal Navy, aforesaid, for example, but a whole list of other things, can, to a certain degree, be traced back to, you were trying to penny packet fight a global war. So, again, the teacher's note on that would be, strong overall results, but tries to do far too many things at once and had some very strange ideas about how to start its projects. The Italian Navy I'm going to give a C+, There's a lot of things to be said positively about individual elements of the Italian Navy, but in the early to mid part of the war, their upper echelons of leadership were lacking. Their tactics and coordination, both generally and particularly with the Regia Aeronautica, were pretty terrible. And ultimately, what were their objectives? Secure the supply lines to northern Africa and hold control of the central Mediterranean, partially to enable that and partially to keep British forces split. Did they accomplish this? Very briefly, occasionally, it could be argued yes, but most of the time, despite the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, the British were fighting both the Germans and them, and then later on the Japanese as well, they ultimately weren't able to complete many of their, or most of their objectives in the face of a portion of the Royal Navy. Now, to be fair, the Regia Marina was built to fight the Marine Nationale, not the Royal Navy, but then, again, in the terms of the teacher's notes, brought a fountain pen to art class and brought a broad brush to a maths exam. At the end of the day, the fact the Italians ended up fighting the Royal Navy is because the Italians declared war on the UK. So, if you don't have the Navy to do that, maybe don't do that. The Germans, I'm going to give them a solid C. And again, this is the limitation of the full war kind of thing, because it would be a very complex set of report cards for them year by year. But overall, I guess you could kind of split it into two, their surface and submarine arms. The submarine arm did okay, didn't come as close to success as they did in the First World War, and ultimately by sort of mid to late 43 was on a increasingly slippery slope towards ineffectiveness, despite the continuing technological evolution that was going on. And that's really the best side of things. So, maybe the U-boat arm in isolation would get a B to B plus, but the surface fleet, well, they managed to throw away a good chunk of their pre-war surface fleet going after Norway. Admittedly, the British did have something of a hand in that, but Oscarsborg Fortress had just as much. And that in turn, knowing that they've started off with a smaller fleet than the people they're fighting, and then having lost a good chunk of it, they're never really able to recover. Yes, Bismarck sinks Hood, but she doesn't make it home from her maiden voyage. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are effectively out of action after the first couple of years of war, minus North Cape, and we all know how well that ended. Whilst the Battle of the Barents Sea probably prompted a little bit of an overreaction from Hitler, it wasn't as much of an overreaction as you might otherwise think. So, the surface part of the Kriegsmarine is a solid D, heading towards D minus if you consider their overall full length of war conduct and success or lack thereof. And so I think that averages out at C. And then that leaves us with the Imperial Japanese Navy, and I would say that I'd give them a solid B to B minus. So a little bit below the Royal Navy and the US Navy, because let's face it, the Japanese Navy started out its involvement in the war pretty strong. For all the fact that I criticise the US Navy in 1942, half of that was the fact the Japanese were scoring a significant number of victories. Now, of course, yes, they Japanese don't win Midway, and they strategically lose Coral Sea and both of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. But in tactical terms, the Japanese actually win 2 of the 4 big carrier battles of 1942, even if they aren't able to exploit that. And they do take a good chunk of the Western Pacific. They do inflict heavy losses on everyone, Australian, American, British, Dutch, etc., etc. And they do continue to be something of a thorn in everybody's side as the war continues. It does take a while to roll them back, but they are very rapidly running out of puff and trained pilots and fuel and everything else towards the end of the war. So, early to mid-1942, they're getting straight A's or A stars, probably an A thanks to Midway and Coral Sea not really necessarily going their way, but broadly speaking, they're doing really well. But it degrades and degrades and degrades and degrades until, by 44, 45, it's like, well, is there even a point filling in this card? you're down to Ds and Fs by then. So yeah, B, B minus, I would say, for the Japanese. Robert Henry Ilston asks, so what problems in the War of 1812 could America's frigates cause to the British if the British could sail first and second rate ships of the line and the frigates were at best fourth rates? There's two main factors involved with this, and one slightly smaller one. The slightly smaller one is that if they came across ships of the line, the American frigates were generally fast enough to run away, and indeed that does happen quite a lot during their various cruises. Either reports that there's, say, a third-rate ship of the line around, or an actual third-rate ship of the line comes over the horizon and the US frigates just book it in the opposite direction. But the two larger issues are perhaps more relevant. Firstly, there's the fact that when the War of 1812 breaks out, Britain has bigger things to worry about. They are still in the process of fighting the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars are still in full swing. Yes, you've had Trafalgar 7 years ago, but there is still a colossal blockade of Europe going on. There's still the French Navy to worry about, even though by the 1810s the Spanish are looking at and then fully switching sides. And so the majority of the Royal Navy's ships of the line are dealing with that much bigger, much more important war, and what's over in the US or on the US coast is a small fraction of the Royal Navy's strength, and a good chunk of it is what can be spared from the front lines as the Royal Navy sees it. There are a few really good ships scattered here and there within that formation of Royal Navy vessels, but if you're looking for the Royal Navy's first rate, second rates, and most of their third rates, they're dealing with the thing that is actually an existential threat to Britain. Of course, as the War of 1812, again, hilariously poorly named, but whatever, as it progresses, especially as you get into 1814, and the Napoleonic Wars are dying down, because yes, you have the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, but remember, Napoleon loses, goes into exile, and then comes back for a bit. So that calmer period in late 1813, early 1814, that's when all of a sudden you start seeing multiple third rates showing up off of every major US port, and suddenly the US Navy's ability to operate is massively curtailed. And somewhat related, but on a slightly different tack, is the fact the Royal Navy just really wasn't thinking about a war with the US. So when war does break out, although obviously there have been rising tensions, initially they're not taking it particularly seriously, and they have forces considerably out of position in terms of the big heavy hitters. So if you look at, let's say, if we take today and we say, okay, right, your big missile cruisers and carriers are kind of your first, second rate equivalents, and your destroyers and frigates of the 2020s are your third and fourth rate ship of the line equivalents, and then OPVs and so forth are your fifth rates and downwards. By approximate ratio of relative strength, it was the equivalent situation of the modern US Navy actually being involved in a shooting war with China, and then randomly waking up one morning, 2/3 of the way through that war, to discover a note saying, by the way, Thailand has declared war on you. At which point, the Thai Navy has a few interesting ships at the smaller end of displacement scales for modern warfare. But, if the US Navy was largely distracted and there was, a couple of LCSs or something bobbing around in the Indian Ocean, then, shockingly, the Thai Navy acting in concert could probably take out one or two of them before everyone got things organised. And that was kind of similar. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's similar. The Royal Navy was sort of going, the who did what now? Why? Oh, ow. Stop swatting my frigates. Go away. And then hit them with a bunch of ships of the line. Geoffrey Conley asks, the Royal Navy's 15-inch 42 caliber gun was considered a very good gun, as shown by the service given by ships like Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, the Ars, and the Renowns. My question is, what if the Royal Navy had put the 15-inch 42s on the King George V's? How would you see these guns being mounted, and how could you see the ships benefiting from having a slightly larger gun? Well, I think in large part you can draw parallels with the early King George V design that actually did have 15-inch guns. Now, granted, those were going to be new 15-inch 45 caliber guns, but weight-wise, they were actually, thanks to new gun-making techniques, going to be ever so slightly lighter than the 15-inch 42s. So, considering their weight is in the same ballpark, you could pretty much look at that design, which became the Monarch class design in World of Warships, to see how they probably would have been used, which would be 3 triple turrets. So, yeah, 3 triple turrets with 15-inch 42s. Now, of course, the Navy does have some spare guns. You've got the guns from Courageous and Glorious, which historically would be used on Vanguard. You've got some in the spare parts pool, if you like. And in theory, they could just start building new ones. And although you'd obviously have to design a new triple turret, the fact that you'd have the guns, to a certain extent, at least for the early ships, the first 2 ships already there, and you already knew that these guns would work perfectly, you could perhaps see them starting the program a little bit earlier. I mean, it would require them doing a little bit of a dodge around the Second London Naval Treaty, or not demanding a 14-inch limit, maybe demanding a 15-inch limit at Second London. But let's handwave that aside. Obviously, the new turret would have more elevation, and probably, like Vanguard, would also be fitted to be able to use superchargers, even if they might not actually do so. But if they do, therefore, maybe start building the ships a year earlier, you might end up also drawing on guns by starting to decommission the R-Class, because remember, originally the King George V was supposed to replace the R-Class, and then because of rising tensions in the latter part of the 1930s, they decided to keep the R-Class going, and then the R-Class replacements were then going to be the Lions. But in this scenario, that they say if they start building the ships early and perhaps build slightly more of them, because then if they've got a head start on guns, they can then the gun manufacturing with bottleneck isn't there so much, and they can concentrate a bit more on just increasing armor production bottlenecks. So you might see the King George V, or some variation of them armed such, run to 6 or even 8 ships. And, you can argue the relative merits of 6 to 8 15-inch armed King George V variants in exchange for losing the R's, which, of course, at that point, you only have to manufacture a limited number of additional 15-inch 42 guns, because you need 9 guns for the new ships. But if you're taking 8 guns from the old ships, you can sort of make up the numbers initially from the spare parts pool and a relatively small continued production of new guns. Now, in terms of overall benefits, well, you've only got 3 engagements between King George V class and peer opponents historically, that, of course, being King George V and Prince of Wales both fighting Bismarck, and then Duke of York fighting Scharnhorst. In those circumstances, you would have the same number of guns up front, 6, 2 triples instead of a 4 and a 2. They'd have the latest shells, but broadly speaking, whether you're hitting Bismarck and Scharnhorst with 15-inch shells or 14-inch shells, probably not going to make the hugest difference. But where it could all make a difference is, as I said, theoretically, you might be able to argue that you could start the King George V a year early and, as I said, build more of them, and therefore in the the first half of the Second World War, when battleships are very much going out and hunting down other targets, you might have more fast battleships available to the Royal Navy. And if you've got more fast battleships available to the Royal Navy, that could lead to all sorts of interesting things, like, instead of King George V being just about in commission and Prince of Wales being literally almost fresh out of the dockyard, when Bismarck emerges, you might have King George V and Prince of Wales pretty much fully worked up, be in service for a little while, and then Duke of York and Anson would be the ones fresh out of dockyard working up. But if you've got 2 modern fast battleships fully worked up in the home fleet, in addition to Hood, and maybe another one just out of dock, then well, then there's more of an excuse to send your King George V's out and maybe keep Hood at home, given the temperamental nature of her machinery at the time, or at least send Hood out with, let's say in this hypothetical case, Prince of Wales and Duke of York. So Duke of York would now perhaps experience some issues, probably not as many issues as Prince of Wales did historically fighting Bismarck, but there's her, and you've got fully worked up, fully working Prince of Wales, and then Hood mixed in there somewhere, fighting the Battle of Denmark Strait, which could change the outcome quite considerably. And then with other King George V available much earlier, then you might see one or more of them deployed to the Mediterranean. There might be another one going for heading out with Force Z. There's all sorts of potential ramifications just from having more ships available. Lieutenant William Bush asks, in reference to Guide 391, the A150-Super-Yamato, Hans Lengerer published a 3-part report on the Japanese super battleship strategy in Volume 7 of Warship way back in 1983. Has there been any further reporting on this topic? The author may have had access to sources not generally available, as on page 33 to 34 he lists the contents for the Japanese Dream Fleet, a 1950 goal apparently based on preliminary notes for Maru Roku Kaikaku, Circle 6, or the 6th Naval Armament Supplementary Program. And on page 169 he thanks Mr. Joro Itani for supplying material used in these articles, and Mrs. Tomoko Rem Takahara for translating from the collection of Mr. Akira Endo. So yes, there has actually been some follow-up from then. So if you go and look in the video description of that 5-minute guide, as with most 5-minute guides over the past 3, 4, 5 years, you'll see a brief source list there, so you can have a look at some of the sources I took information from. In particular, Hans Lengerer has published a number of books, albeit they can be quite hard to get hold of these days. There's one which is just Yamato class, which deals with, so shockingly enough, the Yamato class. And there's also another one, which is part of a series that he's doing, which is called Battleship Tosa Demolition Tests to the Modified Yamato class, which of course includes the Super-Yamato class. That's the Modified Yamato class. So both of those, I think the Battleship Tosa book is a little bit more recent, if I recall correctly. So both of those books by Hans Lengerer contain, obviously, the information he had back then, but also more information that he's subsequently added. And then, as I say, check the video description for one or two other things that sources you might find interesting. Apart from the general overall lack of information on the Super-Yamatos, you will see little bits about them mentioned in other books, but obviously they're not dedicated to them. Quite a lot of information, as again indicated by Mr. Lengerer in that article, is still in Japanese. So there are sources that you can look up if you happen to be able to read or find someone who can translate Japanese, but that's separate to what is available and published in English. Lou is British for John asks, are there other types of submarines other than the Holland type? If so, how do they differ? I'm asking about ships that actually submerge as opposed to ships like the CSS Hunley. If by that you mean, were there other submarine types at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries that formed the basis of various navies' submarine arms, other than the Holland type, which was quite widespread across a number of different navies. In fact, there will be some 5-minute guides coming up in about a month's time covering that. Yes, there were. So the French, the Italians, and a couple of other navies would all start their submarine arms with non-Holland type craft, i.e. entirely homegrown. Technically, the Germans are a bit of an odd one, because the Germans, believe it or not, for the number of U-boats they used in the First World War, were actually a little bit behind the curve when it came to introducing working submarines by about half a decade. And as a result, although the U-1 was homegrown, it was a modified design based off a Russian submarine, and the Russian submarine arm started off with Holland-type craft. So I'm not sure if you could necessarily call the German submarine development entirely independent of Holland influence, but certainly the Italian and French ones were entirely homegrown, as I said, as were a few others. Now, one of the key differences is that the Holland type, if you take a look at them, their profile, even in their somewhat more advanced variants and, people who have based designs off them, it's fairly recognizable being relatively tubby, almost rugby or American football shaped. Whereas, for example, as you can see here, a very early French submarine, that they are much longer, much spindlier, almost in some ways representing or resembling an oversized Whitehead torpedo, and obviously they then fire Whitehead torpedoes, and it's a similar story with the Italian one. So very long, slim, obviously not quite as maneuverable, but probably better shaped for speed, characterizes non-Holland originator submarines. Scott Deederly asks, in March 1912, the Royal Navy required more dreadnoughts for its naval race with Germany, and many of the Dominions donated funds, either through public donations or allocation of tax money, for naval construction. In July 1912, Canadian Conservative Prime Minister Robert Borden agreed to provide up to $35 million to the United Kingdom for construction of 3 dreadnoughts for the Royal Navy. Payment was to be authorised through the Naval Aid Bill, which was introduced to the Canadian House of Commons in December 1912. The Liberal Party bitterly opposed the bill, angered by Prime Minister Borden's neglect of the Canadian Navy that was established by the Laurier-led Liberal government in 1910 through the Naval Service Act. The Conservatives carried the bill on the 15th of May 1913. However, the Liberal majority of the Senate defeated the bill 2 weeks later. World War I began before PM Borden could do anything more about Canadian naval policy. But if the Naval Aid Bill had been passed in spring 1913, what class of dreadnought battleship would have been built, and how would 3 additional dreadnoughts affect World War I and possibly World War II? Well, the consensus is that they would have been Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. That seems to be what the original aim of the bill was for, and to be honest, given the amount of money they were voting through, you could have easily afforded them. Now, as for when they would have been laid down, that's an interesting one, because some people will say, oh, they wouldn't have been laid down in time for World War I in any case. And yes, they wouldn't have been laid down in time to begin World War I, but you have to bear in mind that the final design approval was only given to the Revenge class at the end of March 1913, which would only have been 6 to 8 weeks before the Canadian vote, this time in theory going through. And of course, Agincourt, the theoretical 6th Queen Elizabeth, was also authorised in 1913. So it's entirely possible that the Canadian Queen Elizabeths would have been appended onto this massive order that goes through in 1913 that was originally to cover Agincourt, and at the start it was supposed to be 8 R-class. However, of course, Agincourt, Renown, Repulse and Resistance were all cancelled. Renown and Repulse were then reordered as battlecruisers, partly because Fisher wanted battlecruisers, partly because Renown and Repulse were ordered from private yards, and there would have been big cancellation penalties if they'd just outright cancelled the projects entirely. But then when you look at the build dates, or the laydown dates, so Renown and Repulse were laid down in November 1913, but Royal Sovereign and Royal Oak, which were built, were laid down 2.5-ish months later, in mid-January 1914. And Malaya was laid down only 2-3 weeks before Renown and Repulse were. So just because there might be last-minute orders doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be built. And of course, one of the reasons Agincourt, Renown, Repulse and Resistance were originally cancelled was because they thought, well, the war's going to be over pretty quickly and we can use the money and the dockyard space to do other things, neither of which turned out to be entirely accurate. But there's also the financial cost involved, because Britain is having to redirect funding to a war effort, whereas in this case the Canadian ships are paid for by a third party, the Canadian government, and so financial considerations don't really apply so much. So I think it is entirely possible that the Canadian QEs might well be laid down and indeed completed during the course of the First World War. In fact, what you might actually see is that even if Renown and Repulse go the way they did historically, then at least Resistance and Agincourt, either the British vessels being cancelled, those 2 yards might then receive the Canadian orders instead, which will keep them busy and keeps the money flowing, and then they'll just have to find another yard to build the 3rd ship in, which isn't exactly difficult in 1910s Britain. Now, of course, they would be entering service somewhat later than almost everybody else, so you'd probably be looking at them entering service in, early to mid 1916, maybe late 1916, depending on how things go, because obviously people already know how to build QEs at this point. So the Canadian QEs, one or more of them plausibly might be around in time for Jutland, but it's very likely that at least 1, possibly 2, maybe even 3 might not be ready. So it would be very difficult to argue all 3 would be at Jutland, but it's relatively easy to argue at least 1 would be. Is that going to affect World War I massively? Probably not. I mean, if they attach, let's say, 1 Canadian QE to 5th Battle Squadron, so there's now 6 of them, that might result in Germany losing another battle cruiser, because, well, more 15-inch shells being chucked downrange and all that. World War II is more interesting, because then, of course, the Washington Naval Treaty comes in, and historically the British were allowed to keep all their 15-inch armed ships, build Nelson and Rodney, and they kept the Iron Dukes, the World War I King George V's, and Tiger around. Now, the King George V's were only to be around until Nelson and Rodney were built, but Tiger, of course, stayed around until the end of the 1920s, as did the Iron Dukes. Then they went out of service with the London Naval Treaty. So for the first part, Washington Naval Treaty, I think at that point it's fairly easy for the British to go, okay, well, we'll keep the 3 Canadian paid-for QEs instead of the 4 13.5-inch King George V's, at which point the Iron Dukes become the ships that are being kept around until Nelson and Rodney are completed. That leaves the British with 8 QEs, 5 R-class, Renown, Repulse, Hood, Nelson and Rodney. But if come the London Naval Treaty and everyone's having to downsize again, now if you've got to choose 15 capital ships, you have a bit of a problem, because you now have a fully 15-inch armed, minus Nelson and Rodney, fleet, but you have too many, because you've got, well, 8 QEs plus the 5 Rs is 13, plus Renown, Repulse and Hood is 16, plus Nelson and Rodney is 18. So you've got to ditch 3 ships. Tiger obviously would go at that point. Now, you're not going to get rid of Hood. And it's possible they might choose to get rid of Renown and Repulse at that stage, but unlikely. So I think at that point they might choose to get rid of whichever 3 R-class are in the worst condition. And so you'd have 2 R-class, 8 QEs, Renown, Repulse, Hood, Nelson, and Rodney. The interesting thing, of course, at that point is that rather than then having 5 Rs sitting around essentially being second-line ships for the bulk of World War II, you have 2 Rs, probably the 2 best, so Royal Oak and another, which would have useful convoy function, and then a bunch of much more capable vessels. Of course, the Canadian QEs being somewhat newer, slightly less worn, would be in slightly better material condition, but modernization programs being what they were, you're not going to, I think, see any substantially more fully modernized ones apart from QE Valiant and Warspite. So you'd essentially be looking at their capabilities at being roughly in the realm of Barham and Malaya as they were historically, but maybe a little bit better. So part way between Barham and Malaya and Warspite, because say they'd be less worn and maybe slightly more up-to-date design-wise. Of course, given that Jellicoe went on record as saying he was almost persuaded to have small tube boilers on the QEs, and the amount of funding voted through by this theoretical Canadian bill is a little bit more than is needed to actually pay for 3 QEs, you could always have extra fun and hypothesize that those 3 QEs were built with small tube boilers, in which case they are actually true fast battleships They may, in fact, get lumped with the battle cruisers because they'd be faster than some battle cruisers, and then they would probably be the prime candidates for modernization, even above QE, Valiant, and Warspite in the 1930s, because a small tube boilered QE from the mid-1910s would make a viable fast battleship for the 1930s. Smokey the Bear asks, in the book Mosquito Fleet about USPT boats, it talks about going against F-lighters in the Mediterranean Sea, which sound like armed barges. In a recent 5 failures video on the channel, you covered the German F-class, which sound like they might be shortened to F-lighters, but you indicated these were limited in service to the Baltic mostly. Can you tell us what the Mediterranean F-lighters were? Yes, this is a wonderful example of Allied nomenclature conflicting with German nomenclature. Much like in German, small fast attack boats are Schnellboote or S-boats, and in Allied nomenclature they are E-boats, which is not the same thing. Now, the F-lighters, they're not the F-class, the planned escort ships of the Kriegsmarine up north. These are, in fact, Marinefahrpram. I think that's how it's said in German, or something vaguely close to, which means naval ferry barge. These are a landing craft type that the Germans came up with back when they were actually taking Operation Sea Lion somewhat seriously. These are broadly, at least by displacement, about equivalent to an Allied LCI, landing craft infantry. And then, once obviously Operation Sea Lion didn't happen, a more gunboat variant was developed. They weren't particularly fast, but you could stick a couple of 88mm flat guns and a bunch of lighter guns on them, which then meant you could use them as essentially slow gunboats, although given that they were used for escorting convoys and such like a slow merchantman, it meant they could just about keep up. Now, of course, they're completely useless as anti-submarine escorts. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the speed, but they can just about keep up with the convoy, and if they're covered in AA guns, then obviously it gives them everyone a modicum of defense against either small, like fast attack craft like MTBs and MGBs, or against incoming Allied aircraft. And the Allies, when they ran into them, well, they looked small and relatively unseaworthy, and to be fair, they weren't the world's greatest sea boats, and they were covered in flat guns, so they called them flak lighters, which then became shortened to F-lighter. So, yeah, when you have the USPT boats, which also have European theatre of operations, fighting against F-lighters would be something that they would be doing, so something like what you can see on screen at the moment. And that would be an interesting challenge, because, of course, at that point, the PT boats are a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter weight, and somewhat less heavily armed in the gun department, but they are faster, more agile, and have torpedoes. Coneled asks, John Parshall has said that the US would have been willing to give battle at Midway, even down 5 carriers on the Japanese side to 2 on the US. He's also said that people he knows have run simulations of Midway at 5-2 and 5-3 odds. Do you know anything about those simulations and what they show? And do they back up the idea that 5-2 would have been reasonable? It seems pretty dicey to me. I haven't seen them in detail. They were covered partially in one of the joint videos I did with John earlier covering the Battle of Midway, so you can see some of the output tables from that there. But without me knowing the precise details and everything that went into them, although I'm sure John would be quite happy to talk about that a bit more, just from basic first principles, looking at the history of the Battle of Midway, although on paper 5-2 odds are pretty terrible, it's not necessarily as insane as you might think. Now, was the US willing to give battle at Midway with just 2 carriers instead of 3? Yes. Yes, they were. They desperately wanted 3, but remember, at the time, Yorktown was coming home damaged from the Battle of Coral Sea. They didn't know how quickly they could get her turned around. And actually, as per, the tail end of the video on Admiral Spruance that went out earlier this week, it was originally, when Nimitz was talking to Spruance, it was originally going to be Spruance taking Enterprise and Hornet out to fight the Japanese, which is 2 carriers, and if Yorktown was ready in time, then Yorktown would come with, and Admiral Fletcher, who was the more senior officer, would take overall command, which is historically what happened. But if Yorktown had been more badly damaged, or they hadn't managed to patch her up quite as quickly as they did historically, then it would have been spruance with Enterprise and Hornet. Now, so yes, it's historically plausible. Would a 5v2 fight have gone anything other than disastrously for the US Navy? Quite possibly, because, when you stop to think about it, the Battle of Midway almost pretty much was a 5v2 fight anyway, at least on the sort of main day. The following day, Hornet's aircraft did actually get involved and actually managed to attack something that was relevant, but on the main day, the actual carrier fight, bear in mind that it's Enterprise and Yorktown's dive bombers that do a lot of the damage. Hornet's dive bombers go off on a flight to nowhere, so effectively they're just not relevant to the battle at all. And unfortunately for them, all the Hornet's torpedo bombers manage to achieve is getting killed en masse by Japanese Zeros. And Enterprise and Yorktown's torpedo bombers do a relatively good job of getting shot down as well later on. So you can't even really argue that at least Hornet's aircraft provided some form of distraction, because the Japanese aircraft that dived down to engage them would have dived down to engage Yorktown and Enterprise's aircraft anyway. So, given that historically most of the carrier versus carrier element of Midway was pretty much a 2v5 battle, it's entirely plausible that therefore if you only actually literally had 2 American flight decks, you'd still pull off the win. The question is which 2 flight decks, because obviously if Yorktown is still at home and it's Enterprise and Hornet, if Hornet's air group acts as it did historically and goes off doing its own thing, now it's just Enterprise's dive bombers versus the entire Japanese carrier force. That could end quite badly because there just aren't enough of them. I mean, they'll definitely, take out a couple of Japanese aircraft carriers, but that still leaves the Japanese with 3 flight decks to launch counterattacks from, which is probably not going to end well. Now, obviously, you could engineer some other form of timeline where maybe, a B-25 suffers a catastrophic takeoff accident on the Doolittle raid, so Hornet's out of action, but Yorktown gets patched up in time, so then it's Yorktown and Enterprise, at which point you use pretty much the historical Battle of Midway, as mentioned. Or you perhaps could say that if Yorktown's not available because it's still needing repairs, but Hornet is, well, you've got Yorktown's entire air group. Maybe they shift Yorktown's much more experienced air group over to Hornet and distribute Hornet's pilots and aircraft amongst both Enterprise and Hornet itself, where they can, as spares and backups, or maybe have them all parked up on deck, absolutely ram those carriers solid, with the intention of maybe flying off, let's say Hornet's air group, because I said Yorktown's is more flight experienced, flying them off via a circular route to reinforce Midway. That's still preserving the element of surprise, followed immediately up by the strikes. That's also possible, albeit that would require a lot more shenanigans. So something happening to Hornet on the Doolittle raid is perhaps a little bit simpler. But yes, it could be done, and it could, as long as it's Yorktown's air group and Enterprise's air group, actually be pulled off. Nathapron Hongcheron asks, what were the downsides of the Italian 12-inch rebuild to 12.6-inch, other than accuracy? The rebuild made those guns almost as powerful as the light shell 13.5-inch guns found on the Orion class. And how did they make the guns 12.6-inch? Was it just thinning the liner down? So if you go back to the battleship main gun building video that I did, you'll see that when you're doing wire-wound guns, you have the liner, then you have an initial tube that goes over the liner, and then you do the wire winding, because otherwise, if you don't do that, then every time you replace the liner, you're going to have a giant slinky, which is not good at all. So what the Italians did is they took the liners out of the 12-inch guns, and then they bored out the A tube, the first tube that goes over the liner, to make it a bit wider, and then you can put a bigger liner in, and presumably a new A tube as well. There are some suggestions in some sources they also bored out some of the wire. I find that a little bit difficult to believe, purely because that's a bunch of extremely high tension wire. If you bore out the entirety of the A tube and some of the wire, well, you're compromising the wire. It's no longer going to be under tension as a whole long spring. It's going to be just a bunch of random bits of metal wrapped around it, which probably means the gun's going to explode, and or it's just all going to go ba-doing. So yeah, bored out most of the inner A tube and then replaced it with a liner and tube setup that allowed you to be 12.6 inch instead of 12 inch, because bear in mind that means you've only got to bore out 0.3 of an inch, because that's in diameter terms, 0.3 of an inch on either side gives you your 0.6. Now, apart from the slight accuracy issues, of course, you have removed part of the structural element of the gun, so the gun is going to suffer from drooping somewhat more, which means you're going to have to you're going to have to redo the ballistics table anyway, but you're going to have to redo it. So that's going to contribute to the inaccuracy as well, because the gun's going to be more flexible than it inherently was before, means it's going to whip slightly more, which means that's going to throw off the accuracy, even aside from additional charge, etc., and so forth. But the droop means that as the gun is fired more and more, it heats up, it starts to bend under gravity, and that means your ballistics table is going to be very wide. If you are if you're firing constantly, you're going to have to make a lot of adjustments to take that into account. Whereas a gun that doesn't droop as much, you don't have to make as many adjustments, so that's one less thing to throw off your fire control system. And of course, all this would also cut down on the barrel life before you needed to reline the thing. Not quite as bad as the Littorios, but it would still mean that the ships had to be replacing their barrel liners a little bit more often than they would have done as 12-inch arm ships. I mean, there's also the fact that part of the rebuild involved losing 3 guns from the amidships turret, but that's more a factor of speed than anything else. DM Phoenix asks, why did the Imperial Japanese Navy refuse to take possession of the German dreadnoughts awarded to them by the Treaty of Versailles? Although these vessels were not as cutting-edge as late-war super-dreadnoughts, the Nassaus and Helgolands were less than 10 years old at this point and still quite capable. Also, Japan was not averse to receiving foreign-built vessels around this time, as they had a plethora of British, Russian, and even Chinese vessels in their inventory. Was something noticeably wrong with them, such as unrepaired wartime battle damage? Simply put, they didn't need them, and they would have been an expensive and rather useless maintenance nightmare for the Japanese. Yes, during the Russo-Japanese War and the Sino-Japanese War, they had taken prizes, but those ships were somewhat easier to operate, being a couple of generations technologically further back, and also far closer to contemporary Japanese warships. Whereas with Nassau and Oldenburg, the 2 ships allocated to the Japanese, they don't have a place in the Japanese battle line. I mean, Nassau especially is very slow. Even if you include the Kawachis in the Japanese battle line, you're still talking about dropping the Japanese battle line speed by 3 knots, which isn't great. They don't like that. And the Japanese aren't really, by the end of World War I, rating the Kawachis in their battle line. They're thinking more about the Fusos, Isseis, the upcoming Nagatos, and the Kongos, and that means their average battle line speed is 23 knots or more, at which point that's a 5-knot drop if you keep the Nassaus around, and a 2.5, 3-ish knot drop if you keep Oldenburg around. And both of those ships are armed similar to the Kawachis, and as I said, if the Japanese aren't really rating the Kawachis all that much by the end of the 1910s, why on earth would they want ships that have similar or worse armament and are slower? They wouldn't. The cost of hauling the things all the way over to Japan would exceed the value they'd get as scrap, and hence instead they just went, stuff it, we'll sell it to some breakers in Britain and get some money back from the scrap value. Plus, of course, the High Seas Fleet had gone through quite the period of neglect in the very last stages of World War I and the immediate post-war period, so it's not so much unrepaired wartime battle damage, it's more the fact that they're just not really being cared for very well. And even if the Japanese had decided, okay, fine, we'll stick them in with the Kawachis as a kind of slow battle squadron to pick up the scraps from the main fleet, they would have needed a lot of money to overhaul and bring up to spec. J. Mace asks, the idea of the battleship carrier hybrid seems to be one of the more popular ideas that isn't really very practical. But is the idea of the cruiser carrier hybrid or the carrier destroyer hybrid, using the aircraft to assist in maritime patrol, commerce raiding, and anti-submarine warfare respectively, a more practical ship outside of major surface engagements? A carrier destroyer is not really practical. They're just too small, and US attempts to make a destroyer that could carry aircraft at all ended up being something of a failure. The cruiser carrier concept, whilst on the surface somewhat ridiculous and not really particularly well implemented with ships like Megami, weirdly, it does have a small role in very specific circumstances, although ones that do need a little bit of hindsight, to be perfectly honest. Now, what I'm talking about is something like this, what you can see on screen. This is CF2, a 1930s US Navy proposal for a cruiser carrier hybrid. Now, what you might notice is this is perhaps more accurately a carrier cruiser hybrid. It's pretty much a light fleet carrier like an Independence with a somewhat shorter flight deck and a pair of 6-inch guns, 6-inch gun turrets at either end, so it has a total of 6 guns. Now, there are variants that have a set of triple 8-inch. I don't think those are quite as practical as this one, and, well, that's for a given value. These are not, none of them are particularly practical, but I think for their mission role, these are somewhat better, even though having 2 turrets compromises the length of the flight deck and for the hangar size as well a little bit more. Now, the reason I think this might have a niche role, although weirdly enough not for the US, is as a convoy escort. They're not really going to do very well in general maritime patrol up until maybe the time period of hunter-killer groups in 43 onwards, but at that point escort carriers are cheaper and less expensive to lose to U-boats. But there is, I think, a limited role for this in something like Atlantic convoy escort, or maybe Mediterranean convoy escort, more so Atlantic. And the reason for that is that, these can probably carry a reasonable sized air group, so you could use them for anti-submarine patrols. But because they're going to be a little bit more capable than an escort carrier, you could also fit some fighters in addition to your patrol aircraft, so you could use them to see off things like Condors. And because they have the speed of a cruiser and a little bit of armor and those 6-inch guns, while you're not going to use these against a Panzerschiff or a Scharnhorst or something like that breaks out, much as you're not going to use a light cruiser anyway. But what you could use these for is to hunt down the Hilfskreuzer, because they've got the aircraft, so they can do a lot of scouting. They've got the speed, so they can track them down and close them down pretty quickly. And of course, they can then use their aircraft to launch an air attack on the Hilfskreuzer and then finish it off with guns, or because they have full fire control systems and a sufficient number of guns, they could even use their aircraft to cripple or just observe the Hilfskreuzer and then close in and finish them off with their gun batteries. So they would actually be relatively viable against that. Of course, there isn't any large-scale cruiser warfare per se using actual light or heavy cruisers going on, and you wouldn't want to take a ship like this up in a straight-up engagement against something like a Hipper on the rare occasion that Hipper or Prince Eugen ventures out. But given that these things are supposed to carry 36 aircraft, so let's say that's a dozen torpedo bombers, so given that they make more sense on the British side of things, maybe something like Swordfish, or if the US is going to build them and use them in the Atlantic Avengers, and a couple of dozen fighters, then actually, although you wouldn't use them in a straight-up engagement against battleships, you might, or panzer ships, you might use them still to help you guard against their intrusion. Because if you've got a couple of dozen fighters, or with 36 aircraft, a dozen dive bombers, a dozen fighters, a dozen torpedo bombers, something like that, then if a panzer ship or a Scharnhorst or something like that, or a Hipper, even something that's a little bit too big for you to engage in a gun duel, if it's reported that that's in the area, you've got enough aircraft to put a pretty good patrol line around your convoy. And if they show up at night in the early war period where you maybe don't have night flying, you've got the speed to leg it. But if they show up during the day, well, your aircraft are almost certainly going to spot them. And then you can send a couple of dozen strike aircraft out, which a lone raider is probably not going to do too well against. I mean, you look at the numbers of swordfish that went after Bismarck, they still managed to score hits. If you can send a dozen torpedo bombers against a Hipper or a Deutschland, one or two hits is going to be enough to cripple the thing. And at that point, you can then follow up with your dive bombers, your torpedo bombers if they reload, and essentially reduce it to a burning wreck and either sink it outright or reduce its capability with strafing runs and bomb strikes to a point where you can finish it off with your 6-inch guns. So, as a general purpose convoy escort, they actually make a disturbing amount of sense, albeit that almost everything I've described, apart from hunting down Hilfskreuz and finishing off larger targets, could just be done better with an Independence class, because you can just hit everything with even more aircraft. Greg Germain asks, in your recent video entitled Frigate Duels of the War of 1812, USS President versus HMS Endymion and Friends, you mentioned Endymion's position off the starboard quarter of President, outside, as you say, the arcs of fire of President's broadside and stern guns, yet I got the impression that Endymion was able to use much of her broadside in this position. Why was this possible? Why were Endymion's guns able to fire more forward than President's guns able to fire aft? Could they be trained further forward, or was Endymion such a fine sailor that she could sail at a slightly different angle to the wind yet maintain the distance or even close? It was essentially down to the fact Endymion was a good sailor, but more precisely, as you can hopefully see kind of working itself out in a little sequence as we go, what essentially was happening was initially you had the tail chase, but Endymion was just ever so slightly faster than President, so she was constantly closing her down. And that meant that once she established this position in the starboard aft quarter of President, so if they're both heading in the same direction precisely, then yes, as you said, both ships would be out of each other's arcs of fire. But because Endymion has that slight speed advantage, what she was doing was, whenever her broadside was ready, or at least the forward part of it, because bear in mind the ship is not completely slab-sided down the side, what she would do is then cant herself to starboard very slightly, so slightly off course, so her relative forward speed compared to President's would then become equal or possibly even slightly slower, but it would be just long enough for her to get a broadside off or a partial broadside off in that dead arc where President couldn't really fire on her. And then because she is the faster ship, she can then maneuver back into a straight line and essentially make up any distance that she's lost, if she lost any. The reason that President can't do that is, of course, she's already traveling slightly slower than Endymion. If she does make a similar kind of turn to unmask her, in this case, starboard broadside, then President is going to lose speed, which means, one, Endymion has an opportunity to close up, and if President turns to starboard, Endymion does have the option of whipping to port and then passing by for a rake, because President has lost speed, so that kind of more significant speed losing manoeuvre by Endymion wouldn't compromise the chase. But also, if President does this sort of canting slightly to starboard to bring her guns to bear, well, again, because Endymion has the speed advantage, Endymion could either accept she could go for the rake, as we said, or she could just turn to port and stay in that blind arc. But whatever happens, even if Endymion decides to accept a broadside or two, or turns herself to starboard and they end up with a sort of a slightly off-angle broadside versus broadside engagement, which is eventually what happens anyway. Anything that President does other than sail downwind is losing her speed. And if she does lose speed, then Majestic and co further back are going to start catching up. And that is what President doesn't want, because it might be all very well to very, very gradually reduce Endymion in a prolonged back and forth by trying to stop Endymion exploiting this blind arc position. But if the end of that means a damaged President has now been overhauled by the Majestic, and then it's game over because Majestic has substantially more firepower, and President's rigging and sides are probably not going to be in particularly brilliant shape, which is, of course, also what happened to her. So, yeah, it's essentially comes down to Endymion has the speed advantage, therefore she can afford to lose a little bit of speed with some maneuvers. President, being A, slower than Endymion, and B, being chased by a bunch of other ships, cannot afford to drop her speed at all. Michael Gilson asks, is there an actual definition for the difference between a dreadnought and a super-dreadnought, or is it a PR name like pocket battleship? And if it is real, is it as distinct as the difference between dreadnought and pre-dreadnought, or is it more subtle than that? It's a little bit of a PR moniker, but unlike pocket battleship, which to a large degree was an invention of the press, the super-dreadnought moniker was actually used internally by the Royal Navy from pretty early on, and then it's caught on. So in modern terms, it's not really a meme, it's more of an ascended meme, almost official designation. And yeah, it's a fairly real distinction. So the first super-dreadnoughts were held to be the Orion class. They were termed that at the time. Now, the main difference between the Orion class and all previous dreadnoughts is that all previous dreadnoughts had carried 12-inch guns, or in a few cases like the Nassau's, even smaller than that. The Orions, of course, jumped to 13.5-inch guns, so they carried much bigger guns, and they still maintained a 10-gun broadside, which a lot of 12-inch gun dreadnoughts either had or had less than that. Obviously, one or two would have more. But their overall firepower was considerably greater, because once you added up the broadside weight, 10 13.5-inch guns, even the lighter shell variants that the Orions had, could chuck out a lot more broadside weight than 10 or 12-inch guns from pretty much any other navy. And then other people started building them. So, of course, the British followed on with the King George V's and the Iron Dukes. The Americans started with Texas and New York and the Nevadas and so on. So super dreadnought essentially meant battleship which is armed with guns bigger than 12 inches. So, but that obviously then incorporates everything from the Orions and the New Yorks themselves all the way up to, technically speaking, even things like the Nagatos and the Nelsons and the Colorados are technically all also super dreadnoughts. And so conventional history, you have pre-dreadnoughts, dreadnoughts, super dreadnoughts, fast battleships. I, as you may know from watching previous videos, tend to like dividing up the dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts into generations, so first and second gen dreadnoughts, first and second gen super dreadnoughts, albeit that as I consider the details more and more and more, I'm even beginning to think that maybe you could actually do 3 generations for each. So you could have generation 1, 2, and 3 dreadnoughts, generation 1, 2, and 3 super dreadnoughts, but that's a separate matter. Glenn Ricafrente asks, this was asked in a Q&A at the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, and I thought I'd get your take on it. Was USS West Virginia at Surigao Strait the best battleship gunnery ever, considering that she hit Yamashiro on the first salvo at 22,800 yards at night, and then made multiple subsequent hits to help sink the Japanese battleship? There might have been other hits at longer ranges, but not with all the other elements that characterized West Virginia's performance. And if this was not the best battleship shooting ever, what do you think was? I think it's a little bit of a difficult one to fully quantify, to be perfectly honest, because there are other battleships that landed first salvo hits at night. USS Washington, Warspite, then Valiant at Matapan, obviously Washington at Guadalcanal, etc. But obviously these took place at much closer ranges. And as you mentioned, there are battleships that hit at longer ranges, but not at night and not necessarily with the first salvo. So which characteristic or combination of characteristics do we use to proclaim which is the best? And, yes, long range, at night, first salvo hit, that's very good gunnery. On the other hand, if you want to play devil's advocate, you could argue that with modern US fire control, okay, yes, cribbed off of a cruiser, but it's still very modern, good US fire control, combined with good, at that point, pretty modern, up-to-date radar, because some of the other battleships in 7th Fleet didn't have as good radar, and a relatively predictably moving target that wasn't shooting at them, you could argue that West Virginia had a lot of elements built in that almost guaranteed her success. So was it kind of on easy mode with an aimbot, whereas with both Warspite and Washington's engagements at night, although as we said, yes, they were at much, much closer ranges, the radar that they had wasn't actually good enough to establish a gunnery solution the way that West Virginia's was. They had to use radar to guide themselves in, but the final lock-on had to be done optically, and then obviously they still achieved hits, albeit, once again, at much closer ranges. But, what is more difficult at that stage? Is it more difficult to establish a purely optical fire control solution at a shorter range at night, or is it harder to establish a radar-guided fire control solution at a longer distance at night? That's not necessarily a question I think it has an easy or straight answer, although I would argue that it is harder to establish an optical fire control solution at night, but then, of course, it's at what range does it become easier than a 22,000-ish yard, or almost 23,000 yard shot? Because with the best will in the world, the Warspite and Valiant ambushing Polar, you could miss, but you'd have to be special to do that. 9,000-ish yards, it's entirely possible that you could really screw that up at night, even with the kind of shots that Washington was getting off at Hiroshima. But at what point, at what range do we say, actually, this is too close range, it's easy to do anyway? And then, of course, you just have the sheer physics of the longer range shots by Warspite and Scharnhorst, and then you get into this whole argument, which at some point I'll probably do a video about, which if those of you who watch the Battleship New Jersey channel will probably have seen the video that Ryan Szymanski did, where he was talking about long-range battleship hits, and then you get battleship versus battleship, or is it battleship versus moving target, or battleship versus stationary target, and then do you count near misses or not as hits, and all of this kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't personally think that there is a single answer to what was the best battleship shooting ever. I would definitely say that West Virginia's shooting at Surigao Strait is certainly there in the top 10 or even the top 5. But honestly, I don't know how I would differentiate between the top 10 or the top 5 sets of battleship shooting to say this particular one is the best. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, how did the Japanese transport the Russian warships back to Japan after they captured Port Arthur and defeated the 2nd Pacific Squadron? Were they manned by Japanese crews? Was it Russian engineers with Japanese supervision, or a mixture of both? Two different sets of circumstances, really, because at Port Arthur, by the time it falls, obviously they've got a bunch of prisoners, and pretty much all the Russian ships that are there are sunk or scuttled. They require salvage work and a lot of other work to make good before they can be taken away. So with the Port Arthur ships, by the time they're made ready to be sailed-towed back to Japan, it's pretty much a Japanese operation with maybe a handful of Russians kept around as translators and or technical specialists if necessary. Whereas with the 2nd Pacific Squadron, of course, they're taking surrenders of ships in the open ocean, the Russian crews are still aboard, at which point it's very much more like an Age of Sail prize crew situation where you would have a few Japanese personnel aboard just to make sure that everything is being done as per spec, but the majority of the ship's operation is still being carried out by the Russian crew. Douglas Speck Jr. asks, in the late 1890s, when the US Navy started building steel battleships, construction proceeded with new classes being laid down before others were commissioned or sometimes even launched. The Indiana class and Iowa were fairly normal with their armament layout. The Kearsarge class introduced the Superposed, or so-called two-story turret with an 8-inch gun set above the 13-inch, training as a single unit. The Illinois class then introduced a more modern turret design and a conventional layout, which was repeated in the main class. The Virginia class went back to the Superposed turret, even though it was a modern turret design. Fortunately, this was the Superposed turret's last appearance. Did any other navies go down the rabbit hole of the Superposed or two-story turret? On a battleship level, no. There were a few designs that were put forward for various kinds of turret over the years that involved either a smaller turret on top of another one or guns stacked on top of each other, but nothing that came into active service, on the far side of World War II, i.e. before World War II. And the main reason the US has this issue is that the US pre-dreadnoughts are actually a very interesting bunch. At some point I should do, obviously 5-minute guides on each of them, but I should do a video chronicling their overall development. Because on the one hand, US pre-dreadnoughts on average tend to be a little bit smaller than their contemporaries most of the time because they are under extreme financial and size limitations from Congress. And that's part of the reason they go for these turrets, because they're looking to save as much weight and space as possible. And this is held to be a way of getting what they want, i.e. 8-inch guns, as a secondary battery, whilst saving weight and space, actually having space to put them on top of the 5-inch gun battery that they're introducing with the Kearsarges. But also, with the US, you have this situation of almost all of their pre-dreadnoughts could technically be argued to be almost semi-dreadnoughts. Kind of maybe a semi-dreadnought or hemi-semi-dreadnought, in that when you look at almost everybody else's dreadnoughts, you start off with a 5.9, 6-inch secondary battery or something along those lines, along with your 12-inch guns, and you progress to having more and more and more of them, and then they get heavier, and then you get the semi-dreadnoughts with, 9.2-inch or 10-inch guns, or the Dantons with their 9.4s, and so on and so forth. The US pre-dreadnoughts, however, from pretty much the beginning, at least as far as full-scale battleships are concerned, so the Indianas, they have this 8-inch battery, as well as a small but growing tertiary battery. It's just a question of, do you count the 8-inch as big enough to put them in the semi-dreadnought category? Most people don't, but they are still undeniably heavier than a 6-inch battery, hence I say they're sort of semi-dreadnoughts. And when you combine this need to have an 8-inch battery as well as what we would consider a more conventional secondary battery, and combine that with the fact that you've got a relatively small ship compared to some other pre-dreadnoughts of the period, you end up looking for novel solutions. And one of those novel solutions is, well, stick this turret on top of this other turret. The main reason it doesn't work out, well, twofold. One, it turns out firing those 8-inch guns directly over the heads of the 12-inch guns doesn't do great things for the health of the 12-inch gunners. And secondly, part of the idea was, yes, the 8-inch guns can fire a lot faster than the 12-inch guns. And so while the 12-inch guns are going through their long, laborious load process, the 8-inch gunners can direct the turn of the combined turret, except that by the time everything is being built, especially with the Virginias, to a certain extent even with the Kearsarges, the rate of fire of the 13 or 12-inch guns, depending on which ship you're looking at, has improved to a point, especially again with the Virginias, where that rate of fire advantage really doesn't exist, practically speaking, for the 8-inch. Chief Eyeroll asks, if, for whatever reason, the Japanese Navy decided that the Kongo-class battlecruisers just weren't suitable for their warfighting doctrine, could one of them, say Hiei, or perhaps more, have been converted to aircraft carriers between the wars? Separate from the treaty restrictions and expenses, what capabilities would they have had, and would they have been worth the possible investment? Yes, they could have been. And in terms of their capabilities and would it have been worth possible investment, I think so, actually. Now, of course, we, as you said, separate from treaty restrictions and expense, we are talking about a rather major expansion of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet, potentially up to another 4 hulls. So somebody's going to have to get on the line to the Japanese Naval Aviator Training Establishment and tell them we need a lot more aircraft and we need a lot more pilots. Someone's going to have to really beef up that Japanese pilot production program in order to actually fully man these things. But if you look at the post-refit Kongos, they've got baseline length of around 740 feet. Now, if you look at the capabilities of various other carriers in that approximate size range, and especially if you look at things like the Hios and the Hiryus, so conversions and purpose-built specifically, they are both broadly in the overall size range, but the Kongos are substantially heavier because, of course, they're carrying gun turrets and loads of armour. So in this scenario, theoretically, when they take the Kongos in for what historically is their big rebuild over the course of the 1930s as each one goes in, obviously they lengthen the hull, they do a bunch of other things, but in this case, instead of that, they still lengthen the hull and introduce some anti-torpedo defences, but instead of adding more armour, they would remove armour, because a carrier doesn't need even an 8-inch belt. Obviously take off the gun's superstructure, strip it all down, slap a hangar and flight deck on top, and say, hey, presto, we have a new carrier. And then we have 2, 3, 4, well, 4 total more additional carriers for the Kido Butai. Now, again, drawing on the capacity of Hio and the capacity of Hiryu and the overall dimensions, obviously including width of the Kongos, if you take off all that weight of armour and guns and superstructure and so forth, you're going to partially compensate with that sticking on the aircraft and the hangar and flight deck. But you're going to have a carrier that is capable of well north of 30 knots, so they'll be capable of keeping up fully with the Kido Butai. Poor old Kaga is going to look like the lame duck of the family even more than she already was. They're going to have a degree of protection left in still, so they're going to be some of the better protected carriers around. And I think you'd probably be looking at them being able to operate, I would say, around 60 aircraft, 55 to 60 aircraft comfortably, maybe with a few spares. It depends on exactly how long that hangar is and how deep and tall it is, etc. But yeah, I would say you're looking at roughly Hiryu and Soryu-like capacity. Taking into account they're roughly speaking the same length. Hiryu's, of course, a purpose-designed carrier, but there's a bit more of Kongo and her sisters. Now, would they have been worth the investment? Absolutely they would have been, assuming, of course, they can get the pilots and planes to stick on them, because it's essentially an outside context problem for the Allies. I mean, obviously there would be butterflies, other carriers may get built, other ships may get converted, but specifically for this Pacific War in the US Navy, there's not really anything that directly corresponds to the Kongos in the 1930s that would make for good, quick conversions. Maybe the ocean liner conversions they were thinking of would actually get pressed ahead with a bit more quickly and rapidly in that case. But you're talking about, okay, we're not talking Shikaku's or Akagi kind of performance here, but we're still talking about the Kido Butai going from an on-paper strength of 6 carriers, assuming that everybody's there, to an on-paper strength of 10 carriers, which, let's say at Midway, let's assume one of them is out for maintenance, but that still adds 3 carriers, so you're now talking about 8 carriers, and potentially, at Coral Sea, maybe there were 2. That suddenly turns the balance, because now if Coral Sea is 4 big carriers versus 2 American, and Midway is 8 versus 3, then even if, let's say, looking at Midway, even if Midway goes as it did historically in the opening engagement, so Akagi's down, Kaga's down, Soryu's down, historically that leaves Hiryu to launch a strike that does end up crippling Yorktown and leaving her open to be finished off by submarines. In this scenario, it's not just Hiryu, it's Hiryu and 3 or 4 contemporary, no, not contemporary, but roughly contemporaneous in terms of aircraft capability carriers that can launch follow-up strikes. That's not going to end well, assuming, of course, they can find Hornet and Enterprise. But then, of course, you have the situation of if the Japanese have 8 or 9 carriers heading for Midway, is Nimitz going to commit Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown to try and fight against them? Probably not. He might try something, but it's more questionable as to whether he'd even give it a shot. And at that point, if the Japanese have a larger carrier air arm and a big superiority in carriers, obviously without accounting for whatever butterflies might result therefrom, that potentially hands them a much, much stronger position in late 42 going into 43 for World War II. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, with all the companies that contributed to the development of naval technologies, I find Armstrong and Krupp coming up more often than others. Just how important were these 2 companies to the overall development of naval technology, and, if they were hand-waved away from history, could other companies fill the technological gap left by them while maintaining the same pace of advancement? Both of them were very important when it comes to naval technology, and that's because both companies were not specialist. I mean, they weren't generalist companies in the way we might understand them today, but they were generalist in terms of naval technology, i.e. they manufactured more than one kind of thing, because there were foundries and companies that primarily did steel, so armor steel and structural steel. There were companies that primarily did guns. There were companies that primarily did ships, and so on and so forth. But when it came to Krupp and Armstrong, they started out doing some relatively specialized stuff, like Krupp with artillery and so forth, but they very quickly expanded out to do a lot of different things. So Krupp obviously manufactured guns, it manufactured steel. Obviously Krupp steel, it invented the sort of beginning of the final stage of naval armor, and they also had interest in shipyards. They made fuses and shells and so on and so forth. So they're kind of an omni company when it comes to naval technology to a certain degree. And Armstrong kind of did a similar thing in the UK, and in both cases it was partly just through expanding the company into different related fields, because obviously if you're making guns, well, you can either get the steel from another company or you can make the steel yourself, but it's related to what you're already doing. So then if you've got a steel foundry that's making steel for your guns, well, then you might as well use it to also make steel for the structure of ships, and at that point then why not have a go at making armor plate, etc. I mean, obviously it all requires different equipment, but at the end of the day, you're making steel, you might as well make different kinds. But also both companies would absorb other companies with similar interests and or specializations that they needed. So obviously Armstrong became Vickers Armstrong, Krupp had a hand in Bofors, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, means if you've got your fingers in many pies and you've got a lot of money, then sooner or later you're going to make breakthroughs in various fields, and therefore you show up more often. Now, would other companies have risen up to fill the gap if you had waved those companies away? In Britain, certainly. Well, you had the merger of Vickers Armstrong, you had Beardmore, you had all sorts of British companies that were all doing naval-related stuff. If Armstrong just failed to exist one day, then one or other of those companies would have taken up the slack. In Germany, Krupp's position was a little bit more dominant, so yes, something would have come up to take up the slack, but it's harder to say exactly what ought to point to a field of candidates because, as I said, Armstrong had a bunch of competitors, even if it merged with one or two of them. While it didn't have a monopoly, it was head and shoulders above German companies in a way that Armstrong, for a lot of its early to mid-existence time, wasn't. So something coming up to replace Krupp would have a lot longer of a ladder to climb. HMS Vanguard 46 asks, considering your background in engineering, what is, from an engineering quality perspective, your favourite ship? I think it's got to be, without a doubt, the Great Eastern. Great Eastern incorporates simultaneously the absolute best and worst when it comes to an engineering perspective on shipping. Worst because it shows what a lot of engineers, brilliant as they might be, sometimes, perhaps often, are very bad at, which is project management. Look at the costs and the ridiculousness that went into her initial construction and how it bankrupted a ton of people. Yeah, there's a lot of engineers who can't project manage their way out of a paper bag. So, that's a typical encapsulation. And, if you want to go, yeah, this is why the world isn't just made up of engineers, there's a very good argument there. However, why she is my favourite ship from an engineering perspective generally is she is kind of the example of what humankind can do if there is a brilliant mind with a vision and the skill to see that vision through, financial issues aside, because she is a monstrous Victorian reply to almost every single problem you can possibly imagine. We need power. We want to go very long distances. Okay, great. Well, we don't want the unreliability of sail, but we're going to have sails anyway because useful backup. But on a ship that size, yeah, sure, we're going to have loads of masts and sails. So it is a viable sailing craft. But we do want steam power. But we need to go really, really far on very inefficient engines. We're just going to make it big. This is the square cube law. This is like the god of square cube law in ship form. Because, yes, inefficient engines can't carry enough coal to go to Australia or transatlantic or whatever. Just make it bigger. Eventually you'll hit a point where you have the volume to do so. Okay, well, we're not necessarily all together au fait with trusting either screw or paddle propulsion. Why not have both? We've got the size. We now have a three power plant ship. We've got steam power, we've got screw power, we've got sail power. The thing is built like a tank. As I've pointed out before, she took a blow very similar to the one that did in Titanic, and unlike Titanic, people barely even noticed when Great Eastern smashed into a rock and ripped a massive chunk out of her side. Everyone went, oh, that was a weird vibration. Then they got to New York. Oh, there seems to be a little bit of a bit of a deeper draft than we were expecting. Oh, it turns out there's a socket great hole in the side. Oh, well, there is so much from an engineering perspective to love about Great Eastern. She's practically indestructible. She's got a flipping boiler explosion, for crying out loud. It sends one of her funnels skyward like some steampunk missile. And apart from, a few injuries and casualties on board, the main response is, well, we'll fix that when we get into port next, rather than, oh dear, everything's on fire and we've got a hole in our bottom and we're sinking. She is resilience personified. She is colossal. As I pointed out before, in terms of tonnage and length, the Royal Navy won't deploy a warship bigger than her for decades to come. And arguably, if they just built the Suez Canal a little bit bigger, which was her main downfall, she probably would have continued to be a financial success going forward for quite a while. Now, of course, a few years down the line, as steam power plants got rapidly more and more efficient, you could have perhaps done without carrying half of Wales in coal in your hold, and you probably could have ditched the paddle wheels and so forth and made a far more efficient ship. But for what she was at the time, if it wasn't for the fact that it would probably exhaust Britain's finances, it kind of breaks my heart that poor old Brunel died shortly after Great Eastern was completely ready, because some part of me just wants to see what would have happened if someone had given Brunel a semi-blank check and put him in charge of building warships for the Royal Navy in the age of the ironclad. You know, it would have been magnificent. John McDonough asks, I've been recently studying the historical literature surrounding the appeasement period in the UK. From what I can gather, the consensus seems to be that there is a good argument to be made that the greatest strategic victory of World War II, as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, is the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. The politicians may have had different motivations, like appeasement, but the professional navy calculated that by forcing the Kriegsmarine to build a balanced fleet as opposed to a Kreuzerkrieg fleet, they would be much more likely to defeat it. The subsequent war seems to have played out exactly so. What are your thoughts on this? Is the consensus reasonable, or is this a case of ex post facto justification? I can see both sides of the argument. On the one hand, if Germany is going to start building warships, which they pretty much said they were going to, then trying to constrain them to London Naval Treaty limitations in terms of tonnage and caliber, etc., which they were. You know, and I have some people in the comments said, "Oh yes, Bismarck wasn't treaty breaking because they didn't sign the London Naval Treaty." Please go and read the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. It specifically says that Germany agrees to be bound by the same conditions as everybody else in terms of things like displacement and gun caliber. Anyway, you know, the logic was to prevent the Germans building a 45,000-ton 16-inch battleship or 18-inch battleship. Then if they're bound by the same rules as everyone else, like London 1, then at least their ships will be vaguely competitive with everyone else's, and considering that they'd agreed to a 35% ratio with the British, then the British would say, oh, well, 35% of us, we can defeat that quite easily. However, firstly, there were different rules for subs. Not necessarily the wisest move there, but also the unilateral signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement by the UK really messed up relations with France and set France off on its own little building spree, and it made coordinating with France somewhat more difficult going forwards. France, of course, was much more interested in actually saying, well, to Germany, no, you may want to disobey the Versailles Treaty, but we don't want you to, and we're prepared to potentially force the issue. And as it turned out, Germany took a leaf out of Italy and Japan's book and built treaty-breaking ships anyway. And we know that Hitler was somewhat worried about British reactions because, amongst other things, he mandated that, well, not entirely just because he was scared of British reactions, there were a few technical reasons as well, but he did mandate that the Scharnhorst should have 11-inch guns, in part because he was worried about building them with 15-inch guns, potentially annoying the British. You see, the thing is, when you look at the alternatives to signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, that's, I think, where this whole, oh, it was the best thing possible seems to fall down, because what are the possibilities? If the Germans continue to build Versailles-breaking ships, but without signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, well, one option is that France might go, all right, look, knock it off or else, and since you aren't listening to the or else, we're going to sail up and force you to listen to the or else by blowing up your fleet. And in the early to mid-30s, the German Navy is in no way, shape or form ready to repel an assault by the Marine Nationale, let alone if the French can get the British on board somehow, a combined assault by the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale, they can just put a stop to Germany's rearmament. The Luftwaffe doesn't really exist in any combat-capable term. The German army has yet to be majorly expanded, so the French and the British hold all the cards at that point. The other alternative is that, okay, they don't decide to go all Copenhagen on Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, and they just accept that the Germans are going to be doing their own thing, at which point the Germans, again, have one of two choices. They can either try and build, as you mentioned, for Kreuzerkrieg. Good luck with that, because they still have the same financial and technological and shipyard limitations that the Kriegsmarine had. And frankly, if the Germans do go full Kreuzerkrieg, I think that's actually, especially in hindsight, better for the British, because if the biggest thing the Germans have are the Scharnhorsts, then that frees up an awful lot of heavy-hitting Royal Navy assets to do other things, like go beat up on the Italians, and/or, if you've got a couple of Scharnhorsts and a bunch of cruisers and Panzerschiff floating around, Renown, Repulse, and Hood, assuming you can patch Hood's engines up to last long enough, are going to have an absolute field day competing to rack up the kills. And the Royal Navy has a bunch of cruisers as well. So does the Marine Nationale, for that matter, if they are, at least in the early part of the war. And if the Germans do decide to build battleships, well, if they are clearly and obviously building treaty-breaking battleships, then that acts as a bit of a wake-up call, because if Germany is building treaty-breaking battleships from the mid-1930s, then the restrictions of London II are probably never agreed, because those would, remember, downgrades from London I, which means you'll probably see more town class instead of crown colonies. The King George V's will at least have a dozen 14-inch guns, possibly the triple 15-inch 45 armament that we were talking about earlier in the Drydock. And it will force the British to start rearming a year or two ahead of schedule. And frankly, if Britain and France start rearming a year or two ahead of schedule, they have bigger, well, certainly Britain has a bigger shipbuilding industry than Germany, France potentially if they can find the cash. And that means that when war breaks out, Britain and France, at least navally, possibly in terms of air and land forces as well, are going to be in a much, much better position to deal with Germany and everybody else. So, yeah, actually, I think Anglo-German Naval Agreement probably wasn't a good thing, because if it wasn't signed, either by hook or by crook, the Germans don't have much of a fleet by 1939, or if they try, the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale are going to be much more ready for them. TST1987 asks, I viewed with great interest your recent video on the proposed A150 Super-Yamato follow-up. I'm surprised you barely mentioned those 20-inch guns. There's only so much you can fit in 5 minutes-ish. Anyway, with regards to the 20-inch guns, prototypes were built. Did they ever get a proper designation? Did they work? How good were they? How were they practical even as prototypes? And did any records survive the Japanese post-loss documents purge? And if there isn't really any concrete information, can you speculate on their performance? So what we know about the 20-inch guns is that at least 2 were most of the way to completion. 1 was a bit more complete than the other, but neither was fully complete, therefore neither could be fully tested. But since the Japanese suspended construction of a whole bunch of stuff, including the A150 general, long lead items like the guns, at the outbreak of the war in the Pacific, they never got beyond that stage. So they were never mounted in a turret, they weren't taken down to any kind of test range. As to what happened to them post-war, they seem to have vanished off into the ether at some point. Ironically, the big test guns that were almost as big that they built in the 20s were more extant at the end of the Second World War than the 20-inches were. So I would suspect they were either disassembled and used as high-quality scrap to build other war material, or potentially cut up, destroyed, buried, whatever, to hide them from the Allied occupation troops at the end of the war. But either way, no one seems to quite know what happened to them afterwards. Therefore, based on what we have as best speculation, and if you're interested, then probably your best bet again is going to be the Hans Lengra books that I've mentioned earlier in this Drydock, to have a little bit look at more information. There's a few other books that also mention some information in passing, but that's probably your single best source if you're going to just have the one. Obviously, it's going to have ridiculous armor penetration. It's a 20-inch gun at the end of the day. Would they have worked? Probably. They did have to make some upgrades to their steel industry to manufacture them, but there's no particular reason to say why they shouldn't have worked. At least, given the state of Japanese technology in the late 1930s. In terms of their rate of fire, though, looking at the 18.1-inch guns and looking at other 18-inch guns of the time, and again, the overall levels of technology, I suspect that if you were lucky, you might have managed to get the 20-inch guns to fire at maybe one round every 45 to 50 seconds at best, just because they're just so big. You're going to need so much work to maneuver everything around and get it loaded, which on the face of it isn't too bad, because most of the time everybody is flinging around salvos at the rate of about 1 per minute anyway, waiting for fall of shot and correction of fire control solutions and so forth. However, the disadvantage here is going to be that although you're firing at 1 salvo per minute is entirely within their capabilities, it's close to their maximum rate of fire, which means, unlike, you say, a more typical capital ship that technically can fire 1 round every 30 seconds, and therefore the crews can either take it a little bit easier and be a bit more precise, or they get a quick rest between salvos, a Super-Yamato's crew are going to be essentially working constantly. The minute, or literally the second, a shell is away, they're going to be going through another reload cycle in order to keep up with that basic rate of fire. And of course, the disadvantage is if you do end up in a rather more close range action where people can just start firing as fast as humanly possible, then yes, your salvo 620-inch shells is going to be absolutely devastating when it lands, but the enemy is going to potentially get off 2, maybe 3 salvos, depending on the ship, in the same time as it takes you to get off your 1 big deadly salvo. And that, especially at close range, where colossal armor protection might not provide quite as much protection from enemy shells as you might want, that might be decisive. HMS Implosive asks, had the US Army 120mm gun M1 been navalized, do you think it would have made a good naval gun, and how might it have fared against the 5-inch 38 Mark 12 and the 5-inch 54 Mark 16 guns? It's a bit of a difficult one to determine, to be honest, because the 120mm M1 enters service relatively late compared to the 5-inch 38, so it's going to be on a bit of a downside compared to the 5-inch 38, simply because there'll be a bunch of 5-inch 38s already in service, and you'll be adding another gun in a similar weight category. Now, of course, the 120mm significantly outranges the 5-inch 38, but the 5-inch 38 has a much higher rate of fire. The flip side, again, however, on this, because the 120mm is a 60 cal gun, the flip side to all of this, of course, is that, as you can see, the 120mm is a hand-loaded field weapon in practice, so it has a theoretical RPM just as an open hand-loaded weapon. How that would stack up once you'd stuck it in a turret, obviously in a turret you have a little less space to work with, but you do have a degree of automation if you're comparing it to 5-inch 38. So what effect that would have had on its rate of fire, we don't know. But broadly speaking, obviously, it would outrange a 5-inch 38, so theoretically might be a better gun in that respect. But it's going to be, at least in theory, based on known stats, potentially a slower firing weapon and a somewhat weightier one as well, just because it's larger. Compared to the 5-inch 54, it has broadly similar performance characteristics, so there's not really a huge amount to choose from there. The big question, again, is rate of fire, because once again, it's not turreted, and the 5-inch 54 is, which means that, again, looking at the paper stats, the 5-inch 54 can fire more rapidly. The 120mm being a 4.7 inch as opposed to a 5-inch shell does obviously have a slightly lighter shell. So would that translate into a slightly higher fire rate if you stuck it in a turret that was otherwise as automated as a 5-inch 54's? Who knows? Possibly. But again, not really possible to tell. So, and then of course you've got the whole thing of actually that navalizing it. We're just talking about rates of fire and ranges here. There's a whole lot of other stuff you have to do to a gun to navalize it, to slow down corrosion and so on and so forth. So yes, it could be done, but there's nothing outstanding about the 120mm M1 at the time that it's actually coming into service that I think would make the US Navy choose to adopt it instead of the 5-inch guns that they've already got. John McCarthy asks, when a ship was using forced draft, how much of a pressure difference was there between the engine room and neighbouring spaces? Did your ears pop if you left the engine room? And did they use airlocks? I've never noticed them when touring museum ships. If not, how hard was it to open and close the engine room hatch? Unfortunately, it's one of those questions to which the answer is it varies, because forced draft was, and in some cases still is, in use across a very wide-ranging period of time. So in the late 19th century, you have ships with forced draft, but obviously the pressure levels that are built up in there are going to be somewhat less, just through technological advancement being less at that point, as compared to a World War II ship, where obviously there's more powerful blowers, better construction methods, etc., and more powerful boilers that can withstand higher pressures and higher burn temperatures, etc. So in them, the increase in pressure over atmospheric is going to be more significant. So back in the older days, the pressure might be just a little bit more, and you just have to keep the hatches closed. There would be a noticeable pressure difference if you went in and out, but not catastrophically. Whereas if you go to a ship like HMS Belfast, then as you go through into the boiler room, you will notice there are actually airlocks, and that's specifically because on Belfast and on other ships that were operated at the kind of force pressure gradients that they used, if you happen to open the door to the outside atmosphere, i.e. without an airlock, whilst it was under force pressure, then you'd have a backdraft as all the pressure escaped, and that would lead to massive flamethrowers being made out of the boilers, and massive tongues of flame come out and incinerate people in the boiler room, which isn't really accepted practice. The other thing, of course, is how you are supplying the forced pressure. Now, in a coal-fired vessel, obviously you have to open the boiler to the rest of the boiler room because you've got to regularly feed in coal and take out clinker and ash, at which point you don't really have a choice. If you're going to use forced pressure, you have to pressurize the entire boiler room. However, once you get to oil-fired boilers, you do have a choice, because at that point you don't want the boiler exposed to the rest of the boiler room directly most of the time. Now, obviously, in overpressure situations, Belfast town class cruiser being oil-fired, we're not talking about it being completely and utterly hermetically sealed off, which is why you could get backblast if you drop the pressure. But it is possible with oil-fueled boilers to connect your forced draft airflow directly to the boilers, which means that the boiler burning area itself obviously has increased pressure, goes straight out into the funnels, but the increase in pressure in the engine room itself will not be as significant as somewhere where you're just pressurizing the entire boiler room. And in those cases, you don't necessarily need an airlock going into your boiler rooms. John M. asks, in the 1893 collision between HMS Camperdown and HMS Victoria, it's been suggested that Admiral Tryon was more interested in seeing if his ship's captains would recognise the inherent danger of this manoeuvre and either alter course or forcefully bring the danger to his attention. Given the Admiral's nature, was this not an error of judgment on his part, thinking that at least one of his captains would alter his orders? And do you believe he was trying to test his subordinates' backbone, or he really was just expecting them to perform such manoeuvre with no questions asked? Well, when you look at the whole of the career of Admiral Tryon, he is clearly a tactically brilliant officer and someone who is constantly trying to change things. He's not particularly happy with how rigid some captains are in adherence to doctrine, to the point that, before the collision between Camperdown and Victoria, there are several groundings of various ships because they are carrying out their orders to the letter, despite the fact that, local conditions would suggest that perhaps you should not be doing exactly what it is you're doing at the time. And he'd actually repeatedly issued orders prior to the Mediterranean fleet, telling them that, if you're given an order and this order would result in the grounding or collision of your ship with something, either a ship or a solid object, then your primary duty is to keep your ship safe, and secondarily to try and execute the spirit of the order, if at all possible. And in fact, he backed this up during the exercise in which this collision took place. Just before the fleet sailed for the exercise, he specifically sent out an order, which has been quoted several times, but it reads in part, when the literal obedience to any order, however given, would entail a collision with a friend, paramount orders direct the danger is to be avoided, while the object of the order should be attained if possible. Now, that is a very specific order to give right before a fleet sails on a series of maneuvers that are designed to, put the fleet in positions where potentially collisions could occur, because that will always happen when you're trying to merge columns of ships. And at least I suspect, and I think a few other historians also suspect, that what he was trying to do is, by literally putting it in writing and putting it in, hopefully in the forefront of his subordinates' minds, when he then makes an order that could potentially lead to a collision, where these two columns are supposed to turn and merge in turn, he's trying to get them to think, not just blind obedience, but to go, okay, well, he wants these two columns to come together, but the position he's put us in is such that if we do so, we're going to collide. So is there a way for us to come together in a merge, maybe not exactly the way we've been ordered to, but we are still merging the columns into a single larger one, whether that be a single physical column or two columns very close to each other as opposed to far apart, which they were originally. Can we do that in such a way that avoids this danger? And unfortunately, as it turns out, his subordinate officers on Camperdown, at first, they saw the danger, but instead of saying to Tryon, hey, hang on a minute, this is dangerous, we're going to try and do this, or just executing a semblance of the order to preserve the spirit of it, but maintaining everybody's safety, instead they hesitated. Tryon then sends them a giddy up signal, come on, get moving, and then they just execute the order as given to them, and that results in the collision. Obviously, Tryon takes full responsibility for this before going down with his ship, because ultimately he is the one who gave the order, but I deeply suspect that he was hoping that someone would show a bit of initiative, and as it turned out, he was shown at the last minute that his subordinates didn't have quite as much initiative as he thought they did. HMS Inappropriate asks, after World War II, the US military was concerned about the loss of shore bombardment capability as cruisers and battleships were retired, and so experimentally they fitted an 8-inch gun in a single turret mounted to the foredeck of a destroyer. This got me thinking, were any ships similarly overgunned during the Age of Sail, for example fitting a sloop with a 24-pounder gun? Would there be any advantage to this, or would it just be impractical and silly? Generally speaking, in the Age of Sail, the size of the gun that you could use on a given ship was rather ruthlessly dictated by the actual physical dimensions and strength of a vessel. Because while you could finagle things in post-World War II to stick a semi-recoilless 8-inch gun on a destroyer, the simple fact was that obviously in the Age of Sail you had many guns. Even on something like a sloop you might have 16, 18 guns. And if you change them from, say, 9-pounders to 24-pounders, that would actually significantly increase the overall weight of the ship. The ship itself might not be able to take all that weight, especially concentrated. And overall, that weight would do horrible things to its stability and its buoyancy. Not to mention, of course, the ship's sides might not be strong enough to withstand the recoil of, say, a 24-pounder. And then you've got to have the crew to actually man the thing and reload it. And yeah, the difference between the weight and size of armament overall versus the weight and size of ship was a lot closer in the Age of Sail than it would be later on in the Age of Steam and Steel. Now, That's not to say you didn't have small craft armed with heavy armament. You certainly did, but it would tend to be at the expense of almost anything else. So bomb vessels were a good example. They're not particularly large, but they mount monstrous great mortars on them. And gunboats, as attempted to be used by the US in the first couple of decades of its existence, and used somewhat more successfully by the Danes during the Napoleonic Wars and various other places, they sometimes are not even really ships. Sometimes they're just particularly large rowing craft, but they might have a single 24 or even 32 pounder mounted on them. And the advantage of that is, of course, that's quite a lot of firepower on a relatively small and therefore technically expendable vessel. And you can have lots of those vessels, and thus the idea, at least in theory, was that collectively these could add up to a force that could fight full-on capital ships. As it turned out, it doesn't really work unless there's some kind of environmental condition that curtails a true warship's movement, like no wind or lots and lots of islands limiting their maneuverability. But all of that aside, in terms of heavily overgunned vessels in the Age of Sail, which actually maintain their broadside armament as planned, i.e. they have lots of guns, there are a few examples. The best ones would be HMS Glatton and HMS Rainbow, because those ships were, at least for a time, fitted out entirely with carronades. Now, of course, a carronade is a lighter weight, because it's shorter barrel and shorter range, somewhat lighter construction version of a cannon, and therefore you could mount much heavier carronades in terms of shot weight, so 32 pounders, for example, in places where you could historically only mount lighter guns. Rainbow, for example, both Rainbow and Glatton at various points went into battle with upper deck guns being 32 pounder carronades and their main broadside battery being 68 pounder carronades, which, despite the fact they were only small ships in the grand rated ships spectrum, meant that in terms of just sheer weight of shot at close range, they could actually outmatch quite a few first rates. Of course, there are other factors mitigating against them being the true equal of first rates, apart from range, construction, and number of shots, etc. But that side anyway. So you could consider them very seriously overgunned. And as we saw in the War of 1812 videos, when Constitution faced off against Sion and Levant were individually considerably smaller than Constitution, but had broadly similar weights of broadside due to being almost entirely loaded up with carronades. But the best example would be Rainbow, because at one point she captured a French ship, the Hebe, or Hebe maybe, that she's chasing her down, and on paper the two ships were roughly the same size. The French ship had longer range guns, so if she'd realised what was going on, she could have stood off at distance and shot Rainbow to pieces. But there was a chase. Rainbow started firing with her bow chasers. One of those shots scored a fairly devastating direct hit. The French captain looked at the shot that had come in, realised this was the 32-pounder shot, and he concluded that if the ship chasing him was firing 32-pounders as chase guns, well, the only ships that he knew of that carried 32-pounders were ships of the line, third rates and up, and therefore, all appearances to the contrary, he concluded that Rainbow must be a disguised ship of the line, trying to lure him into a straight-up fight where his ship would be very quickly demolished. And so he then struck his colours after firing a single broadside into the ether for the sake of his honour, which was a fairly easy capture, therefore, for Rainbow. Now, in theory, if Rainbow had actually gotten into a straight-up broadside fight with the French ship, it probably would have been over almost as quickly because of the sheer weight of broadside that the British ship could bring to bear. But as said, it would have only taken the French captain to realise that the enemy ship can only fire at close range for the tables to be turned. And we see this practice sort of evolving a little bit past the Napoleonic Wars when you look at some various vessels, including one of the biggest examples, obviously, the US Navy's only first rate, where instead of doing 32, 24, 18 or 12 pounder, etc. in the various gun decks, they just go with varying lengths and weights of 32 pounder, which again massively increases the broadside weight, but at the expense of range. Randwick78 asks, how were bronze cannon originally made, and did this change in the Age of Sail? And how did it differ from the construction of early iron cannon? Bronze cannon pretty much were always made in the same way. There's not a huge amount of difference during the Age of Sail. You melt up a bunch of bronze, you make a mould for the cannon. This could be a solid reusable mould, it could be a temporary one where you have a wooden cannon essentially that you form a mould around. However you do it, you pour the bronze into the mould, you wait for it to cool, you get the mould off or break it off, again depending on whether you're using a reusable one or a disposable one, and then you clean it off, trim it, etc., etc. The only real variation on the theme is whether you cast it as a solid lump of bronze and then bore it out, which in some ways can result in a slightly more reliable product, but involves a lot of waste bronze and a lot of work to bore it out again, which of course you can then reuse what you've bored out, but a bit more complicated. Or if you put some kind of slightly undersized cylinder where you want the bore of the gun to be, and thus you cast it as what you would recognize almost immediately as a cannon, i.e. there is a bore that you could put something in. Now, of course, I said undersized because you still would bore it out a little bit to make sure it's all nice and even and so forth, and you have to put in the touch hole and so forth. But that is basically how you make a bronze cannon. Obviously, they need a little bit of a while to cool because that's a lot of bronze, that's a lot of thermal energy that's got to dissipate. And now, the way this differs from early iron cannon is that iron cannon at first are built in a manner very similar to actual barrels, hence barrel of gun. And that the only real difference is that hopefully if you're building an iron cannon, you don't have the bulge in the middle like you do with an actual barrel, but essentially you would build up a barrel with staves of iron, which then would have hoops put on them, and you might have a very thin-walled liner on the inside just to provide a smooth run for the cannonball, or smoothish, and these hoops would be heated, fitted, and then shrunk on. So again, pretty much the way you do a barrel, as you can see here in this photo of a cut-through of an iron gun off of the Mary Rose. Matt Blom asks, in your recent video 5 Naval Engineering Failures regarding the section on Sovietsky-Soyuz, you mentioned that the Soviets failed to correctly copy the Italian Pugliese torpedo defense system, highlighting its precise manufacturing requirements. Poor manufacturing tolerances on Italian shells during the Second World War are meme-worthy in the naval history community, but if the Italians designed such a precisely manufactured torpedo defense system, other than poorly made shells, would that infer the engineering and build quality of most of the Italian Navy was actually rather good and poor shell tolerances were the outlier? Yes, pretty much. Italian engineering, when it came to shipbuilding as a whole, was actually pretty darn good. I mean, one example would be their armour plate. So their armour plate is not quite as advanced metallurgically as British or German plate, but they actually threaded a needle that everybody else missed for whatever reason, which is that when it comes to the proportional thickness of the hardened face of plate armour, if that hardened face is very thick proportional to the overall thickness of the plate, so, let's say we're using a 12-inch plate as an example, if, say, the hardened face is half of the depth, so 6 inches deep, then that plate will perform less well, due to various complex physical reasons, against heavyweight shells, which might seem counterintuitive, but is actually the case. So if you have 3 12-inch plates, and one the face hardening is, let's say, using arbitrary figures, 3 inches thick, another it's 6 inches thick, and another it's 9 inches thick, so the last one, 3/4 of the plate is hardened. The one with the thinnest face plate, within reason, obviously you don't want to go too thin, but the 3-inch thick one will in theory do better against heavyweight shells. But if you scale that down to, say, 4 or 5-inch plate, the type of plate you might find on a cruiser, and you maintain that same 1/4, 1/2, 3/4 thickness, at the smaller scales, the thicker face hardening will perform better. Now, everyone apart from the Italians chose an approximate depth of hardness and just stuck with that. The Americans were a bit of an outlier in having very thick hardened layers, and the British went somewhat thinner, and that meant that British plate, combined with the fact it had very good metallurgical properties, was very effective when you stuck it on a battleship. But British plate with a proportional face hardened thickness layer on a cruiser was a little bit less effective than it otherwise could be. The flip side is the American plate was a little less effective than it would appear to be on paper because of this over thickness on battleship scales, but when you put it on a cruiser, it was really effective. The Italians, where this all comes back to, they actually manufactured their plate in varying face-hardened thicknesses. So their cruisers had a very thick face-hardened layer, and their battleships had a, proportionally speaking, slightly thinner face-hardened layer. So they actually got the best of both worlds. So even though their plate metallurgically wasn't the absolute top of the line, their actual engineering and technology behind manufacturing it was pretty much top tier, and their quality control was pretty good as well. And yes, while the Italian high velocity guns did have issues, which had various reasons for the issues, etc., I can discuss that another time, but just being able to design high velocity guns that didn't immediately blow themselves to pieces is actually quite an engineering feat. So yes, on an engineering level, the Italians are actually pretty darn good naval engineers in the Second World War, but as with almost everybody, you will always have a few statistical outliers, the accuracy of their guns being one of them. And of course, there is a difference between engineering and design. So when you look at some of the condottieri type cruisers, etc., and the fact that a lot of them don't really perform very well in battle, that's not necessarily really down to the Italian engineers' fault or the quality of the engineering that went into them. It's just the simple fact, if you design specifically a very small, very high speed, but very lightly protected cruiser, well, that's what you're going to get. You might have the world's best engineered cruiser of that type, but if it comes up against somebody who smacks it around with repeated 6-inch shell hits, doesn't matter how well built it is, it's still going to be, having problems. Or to turn a phrase, the world's most perfect crystal decanter will still lose a fight with the world's most crudely hewn stone floor. Seb Dove asks, I've always wondered what the scene was like inside a battleship's plotting room in CIC. I know it wasn't just officers and men with calculators figuring firing solutions out, but could you describe the scene? Was it calm or hectic, say on a British King George V class engaging a hypothetical enemy battleship in clear weather in early 1940? It's going to vary quite considerably depending on time period within World War II and situation, because obviously if you're under massed air attack, things are going to be a little bit more fast moving and therefore a little bit more frantic than if you're in a steady engagement 1v1 with a battleship. But the time period makes specifically a point because it's going to dictate to a certain extent how much verbal input you need with things. So what I mean by that is that in the latter part of the war, this is an American Mark I fire control computer, by the way, in the latter part of the war, an awful lot of the inputs were automated. And so there would be, relatively speaking, few manual inputs that you needed to do, and then make minor corrections as the fighting went on. So at that point, there would be relatively minimal chatter, because of course, if everyone's talking over each other, then nothing's going to get done, because no one can hear the information that they need. And usually, unless you're Admiral Lee and you've installed it right behind the bridge, both CIC and the plotting room are going to be deep in the ship, so they're going to be away from the immediate hubbub and blast of the guns and such like. Earlier in the war, in the situation you described, a lot more of those inputs are going to have to be manual, so you would hear a lot more conversation because people would either be using the internal phone system or voice tubes to receive information from elsewhere on the ship, or if that information was being relayed to them, say from rangefinders or something, it might still need to be looked at. So there might be, say, a dial at head height that says, okay, the range is 22,000 yards, and someone who's actually operating in the King George V's case, the Admiralty Fire Control Table, is either going to need to look up and go, oh, okay, right, we're at 22,000 yards, dial in 22,000 yards on the computer, or potentially, if they're, deep into operating the thing and don't really want to look away because they're obviously also in charge of relaying outputs, then they might be asking, okay, range from rangefinder, and there's ranges from multiple rangefinders. There's the ranges from rangefinders at the top of the superstructure, there's ranges from rangefinders on the main turrets and such like, and so people will be relaying that kind of information. So it would probably resemble the hubbub of a quiet set of conversations going on, so loud enough for them to be relaying information without overwhelming when the particular officers in charge are calling for specific bits of information. Of course, as more feedback comes in, so say someone on the bridge calls down and says, right, well, that sailor was 400 yards over, then as the pressure goes up, then things might start to get a bit more hectic. And of course, if a call comes down, direct hit scored, keep that fire control solution going, then there'll probably be a lot of cheering and so forth. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, hi Drac, your recent guide on Bern got me wondering about why HMS Eagle was relatively successful as a carrier, while Bern was not. They were both conversions from battleships, and their speed difference wasn't enormous, and the size of their air groups wasn't dissimilar, and yet Eagle remained an effective, if not necessarily front-line carrier until she was lost, while Bern was more or less a washout from the start. If not just her slow speed, why was she so dismissed? There's a lot of little factors that go into the difference between Eagle and Bern in terms of overall success, but actually speed is quite an important one. Now, that factors into one other thing, which is the Eagle's flight deck was about 50 foot longer than Bern's. Now, 2.5 knots, which is the ostensible speed difference between Bern and Eagle, 21.5 to 24 knots, might not sound like all that much. But when you take into account that when the ship goes at full speed to generate wind across the deck to help aircraft take off, every single knot counts. When you realise that Eagle, therefore, is going to get a bit more air over the deck for similar wind conditions, and has that extra 50 foot on the flight deck, so the aircraft get a bit more of a run-up before they have to go airborne, you suddenly realise that for the same weather conditions, Eagle could either get heavier or better aircraft off, or Eagle can utilise a smaller part of her flight deck to get the same aircraft aloft, which means more handling space for aircraft behind wherever it is the takeoff point has been mandated to be, which makes it a lot easier to manage the aircraft on Eagle. And related to the flight deck, there's also an element of doctrine in that you've got those big clamshell slow lifts on Bern, which limit the speed at which you can actually recover aircraft. Now, okay, interwar Royal Navy practice was to recover an aircraft and stow it as well, but Eagle was capable of doing that from a slightly better place lift, and it went a little bit faster. So obviously that made Eagle, generally speaking, a slightly better operational platform for aircraft, but also the speed comes into play in another way, and bearing in mind that's absolute top speed, and broadly speaking, Eagle tended to stay closer to her theoretical top speed during her career than Bern did. Bern was known for dropping off speed from her theoretical max a little bit more, which obviously exacerbates the speed difference. But the other issue with the speed is one I actually mentioned in the video, and that is the carrier has to operate with the fleet. Now, the fleet might have a theoretical top speed of 21 knots in both the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale's cases in the interwar period, if they're going by the speed of the slowest capital ship. But if the carrier wants to operate aircraft and the fleet isn't sailing directly into the wind, the carrier has to break away from the fleet to launch its aircraft and potentially also recover its aircraft. And then, because it's going away from the fleet, it has to catch back up with the fleet. And this is where the speed really becomes important, because not only does Eagle have the capability of launching her aircraft and recovering them faster than Bern, for the reasons we just mentioned, but also because she is that little bit faster, when it comes to catching up with the fleet, she is actually faster than the battle line speed. So even if the battle line is going at 21 knots, Eagle can catch up. And if the battle line is going a bit slower, 16 or 18 knot cruising speed, or maybe even slower than that, then the margin of difference between Eagle and the fleet is quite a bit, and Eagle can make good time catching up with the rest of the fleet. Whereas, as we saw with Bern, even if the Marine Nationale battle line was cruising at a relatively pedestrian pace, Bern took forever to catch up, which massively limited her overall utility. Plus, of course, as we said, because she's operating things slower, she's going to end up further away from the fleet and therefore has a longer distance to travel to catch up in the first place. So those are some of the bigger reasons why Eagle tended to be a slightly more successful carrier than Bern, even though it might seem at first glance that perhaps the speed difference isn't all that much. It did actually make quite a difference. Andre Decoult asks, could you please explain the differences between a Yarrow boiler, a Babcock and Wilson boiler, an Admiralty 3-drum boiler, and a Japanese Campon boiler in the first half of the 20th century, especially post-World War I? To a limited degree, part of the difference is just this is the person who makes them. But there are some key differences that can help you recognize them. So what you can see here is a Yarrow boiler. Now, a Yarrow boiler is a 3-drum boiler. So you have a big drum at the top for steam and 2 water drums at the base. With a Yarrow boiler, most of them, the water drums are these half cylinders, but in particular, key features to look out for that make it a Yarrow boiler are the pipes between the water and steam drums are dead straight. On almost all others, there's at least some bend, and in a lot of them, quite a lot of bend. And the other thing is the absence of what's called a downcomer, which, as the name might suggest, that is a pipe or multiple pipes which cold water or cooled water from the steam drum is returned to the lower drums. Now, Yarrow had demonstrated that, in fact, you could do this through the same pipes, which obviously saved on weight. The Admiralty 3-drum boiler, as you can see here, in actual fact starts off as a development of the Yarrow, but key differentiating features are that the water drums are completely cylindrical, and although it mostly has straight tubes between the two, as you can see on the underside there is a small degree of bend to some of them. Now, the Admiralty pattern 3-drum boiler went through a number of iterations. Most of them look something like this. There's sometimes on some Admiralty patterns a little bit more of bent tubes, and very occasionally a downcomer or two, but most of the time they stick with the Yarrow idea of not having downcomers and very minimal tubing. A lot of 3-drum boilers, as I said, will have far, far, far more bent generator tubing than either the Admiralty or Yarrow types. Now, the Babcock&Wilcox boiler is probably a very good example of how it's partially a loose description of design, much looser than Yarrow or Admiralty 3-drum designations, but also much more a designation of who's actually manufacturing the blasted thing. So this is an earlier Babcock&Wilcox unit, and apart from the fact that all the tubes are stuck together and canted to slightly to one side, the other thing that's quite notable is that the water and steam is all in one tank up top, as opposed to in the 3-drum boilers where the water's in the lower tanks and the steam tank is up top. But this is an example of a later, more advanced Babcock&Wilcox steam boiler. In this case, you can see you now do actually have a separate water drum and a steam drum, but as you can also see, the tubes are kind of a little bit all over the place as compared to the rather neat Admiralty and Yarrow types. Now, I don't have a particularly detailed Campon-style boiler arrangement to hand, but, well, here's a partially disassembled Campon boiler arrangement in a Japanese destroyer, so some of the casing and other ancillary stuff has been taken off, but not all of it. Now, again, with Campon boilers, you can get large tube and small tube ones because it is as much a manufacturing designation as a particular design style, but a Campon boiler has some similarities to an Admiralty 3-drum boiler. It's a 3-drum boiler. It has cylindrical water tanks, but as you can see in part from here, you've got fairly substantial downcomers, so that's not something that Yarrow types and most Admiralty 3 drums do. But the Campon general design does vary somewhat, so you can get Campon boilers where the lower cylinders are sort of oval in cross-section. In others, they are perfectly cylindrical, and the tubes that run from the boiler to connect all the drums together. In some Campon type boilers, they're dead straight like Yarrows. In some, they're actually on a continuous curve, so resembling some other foreign boiler types. And in some, they have relatively short radius sharp curves connecting at top and bottom, and sometimes just at the bottom. So with Campons, it's a much, much wider variety of arrangements, but most of the time you're looking at something that resembles a variation on an Admiralty 3-drum boiler, but with more curves allowed. Which isn't exactly shocking, given where the Japanese were getting a lot of their design ideas in World War I and immediately pre-World War I from. The fact that they adapted Royal Navy and British designs, kind of to be expected. Bjarki Hilmarson asks, how did the smoke from coal-powered ships affect the sails where applicable? I.e., did sails end up as black rags soaked in coal dust? It was certainly a risk. Coal smoke could and would turn your sails into stained, horrible, gummy rag things very quickly if you weren't burning the coal very efficiently. And let's face it, in a lot of sail steam vessels, combined power, that really wasn't happening. However, what you tended to find is that there were two primary responses to this. Firstly, most of the time one would sail under steam or under sail, but not both at once, partly because obviously that involves double the workload. Your engineers are having to work full on your power plant, and you've got a bunch of crew up in the sail on the yard arms, but you might not get actually all that much speed as a result of it. So it's better to run on one or the other, and that makes life a lot simpler. And therefore, obviously, if the sails are furled, there's much less risk of them getting dirty. But occasionally, you do have to sail with both, as you can see here with HMS Sultan. But the remedy is also clearly on display, as you can see, because if you track all that horrible black coal smoke, you'll notice that the foremast and the jibboom the bowsprit, have their sails all fully set, but then on the mainmast, they've furled the lowest sail on the mainmast to allow the smoke to pass through that area, and the mizzenmast doesn't have any sails set at all, and that's where most of the smoke is passing. So they're keeping basically the sails that are wholly, or in the case of the second largest sail on the mainmast, mostly clear of the smoke. They've got those hoisted, and the ones that would be most directly impacted, they're just not using. There's also a secondary issue, which is, of course, if you have people trying to manage the sails whilst the engines are going, you can pretty much tell quite quickly those yard arms where the smoke is prevalent. That's also where the exhaust gases are going to be most prevalent. That's a very good way to have people just randomly collapsing, poisoned off of your yards, which is not good for anybody. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, with the recent D-Day celebrations just taking place, there was talk of the Royal Navy, US Navy and various free navies all taking part in some form or another. There was, in one small article, also mention of the participation of 24 naval officers from the Chinese Navy, pre-communist takeover of course, who were served aboard Royal Navy vessels. How and why did they get there, and are there any other obscure nations taking part in Operation Neptune? So the Chinese officers aboard various ships up to and including battleships were there as observers dash also kind of trainees, and they were part of the Chinese Nationalist Navy under Chiang Kai-shek, the group that would obviously later on end up skedaddling over to Taiwan when they lost the fight for mainland China. But at the time, of course, nationalist Chinese forces held a good chunk of mainland China, and in the early part of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek said, look, I'd like some of my naval officers to be trained with you guys, i.e. the Allies, and I think it was something like 74, 75 of them ended up actually making the selection process and being dispatched. 24, as you mentioned, get on Royal Navy vessels, and the balance went on US Navy vessels. And as a result, some Chinese officers were actually present at D-Day, including this gentleman, whose picture you can see, who goes by the name, which is, I know it's actually a serious Chinese name, but it has such a double entendre meaning in British English that it's still slightly amusing to me. So his name is Lam Ping Yu, which if you pronounce it fast enough sounds like lamping you, which is British English slang for punching someone in the face. I bet you he got all sorts of stick from his shipmates. Now, the problem with other, if you like, obscure nations taking part in Operation Neptune is that there were so many British and American and Free Navy ships around that basically when you get to some of the smaller Free Navies, they are so small that as well as maybe having a corvette or two, quite often some of the smaller Free Navies would have contingents aboard other vessels, like mostly British vessels, and therefore you might end up in a situation where a Free Navy might not have a specific ship representing their forces at D-Day, but there might be elements of that Free Navy still present aboard other British ships. And where you divide the line between outliers like random Chinese officers present off of D-Day to small contingents of a Free Navy that hasn't managed to send a specific vessel can get very blurry. And of course, it's also very difficult to track down because there's an awful lot of people involved. So unfortunately, naming very, very specific obscure nations outside of nationalist China who also had people there, that's not something that's very easy to do. But I can assure you there would have been a number there that you wouldn't otherwise think. Felix B asks, when did the combination of floating dock and self-propelled come about? As late as World War I, non-seaworthy ships were sent far away, like paddle steamers bound for Mesopotamia being sent off with a little bit of bracing and some prayers. As far as I can tell, the idea of a self-propelled mobile floating dry dock seems to post-date the time period the channel covers. The ARDM, or Advanced Repair Dock Medium class of the US Navy, one of which ARDM-1 USS Oak Ridge you can see here in the foreground, it's the bigger of the two, they were ostensibly designed for propulsion, but never actually fitted with it and ended up just being towed around. And that seems to have been the case for pretty much all other floating dry docks in World War II. Subsequent in the Cold War, someone somewhere along the line has invented the self-propelled floating dry dock, although where the line between self-propelled floating dry dock and heavy lift ship that happens to be capable of semi-submergence to pick up a vessel and sail off with it, where that line is, I'm not entirely certain. But yes, unfortunately, when it comes to the exact date and which exact vessel counts as the first self-propelled as opposed to towed floating dry dock, I don't know. Loz Spencer asks, in all 300 plus episodes of the Dry Dock, is there a question or questions you've been waiting for someone to ask because you know it has a really cool answer? Not specifically. There are a few questions I've looked out for over the years, but they run into the problem of, questions where I'm looking at, oh, I wonder if someone's going to ask that, tend to also be on subjects which the answer is really, really not one that's suitable for just a few minutes in a dry dock. I've been kind of semi-hoping someone will ask it, but also knowing that the answer is going to be, a full-length Wednesday video if not more, because the answer is so complex and detailed. There are a few questions wherein, I'm occasionally just looking around the library and going, ooh, if someone asked me that question, they'd think it was really, really obscure and it would be really difficult to find. But I would be able to pull something off the shelf and go, well, actually, I'm glad you asked, because I can now tell you exactly what was going on at that time, completely apropos of nothing and out of the blue. So, if anyone wants to know what a 17th century French knight thought was the best way to construct and destroy star forts, boy, have I got the manuscript book for you. If anyone wants to know, if someone's going to ask me, what signal did HMS Repulse send in September 1919? I have a signal log from 1917 to 21. Or if someone wants to know, what does a Beaufort's sales book look like in 1900? These kind of really weird and obscure questions which someone might ask to throw a spanner in the works. Those are the kind of things I'm thinking, oh, go on, somebody ask those, because then I can pull the really obscure stuff off the shelf and start giving weird and wonderful answers. Farenda Ritter asks, for the honour of the Royal Navy, would you please quickly tell us the story of HMS Newport at the Suez Canal opening and the response to that incident? What are your thoughts on the event? So when the Suez Canal was due to be opened, all great and good from across the world were invited, and obviously a lot of them showed up in various ships in various ways, shapes and forms. However, the Suez Canal had been built under the auspices of a French company, albeit most of the labour had been supplied locally, under somewhat forced conditions, but nonetheless, the French were responsible for the canal, and so they had therefore arranged for the French Imperial yacht, l'Aigle, the Eagle, with the Empress aboard, to be the first ship through the canal. However, a small gunboat being used as a survey ship, HMS Newport, was in the Mediterranean at the time and was also there for the opening festivities. And of course, Britain being the biggest naval power, no one wanted to annoy them, even though Britain had been largely against the Suez Canal being constructed, mostly on the grounds that they controlled the other routes to and from Asia, and obviously without some kind of major conflict, it would be difficult for them to control this one. But there you go. Either way, Newport was there under the command of Commander George Nares, or Nares, or however, Nares, however you want to pronounce it. It's the UK. The pronunciation differs every 20 miles or so. But so he was there aboard HMS Newport, and he noticed that, well, of course, l'Aigle was going to go through first. And this is completely intolerable. Britain rules the seas. Britain should be first through, even though it's a French canal. And, well, let's just say the Empress probably outranks a commander. So that night, in the darkness, he decided he was going to switch off all his ship's lights, and using no lights and no power, just a little bit of sail and maybe a little bit of rowing. It's unclear exactly how he did it, but it was very, very stealthy. He positioned himself, and Newport, of course, ahead of l'Aigle, right at the entrance to the canal, in such a manner that it would be impossible to dislodge Newport from its now pole position without a great deal of work, which would, of course, massively delay the opening ceremonies, which would be hugely embarrassing. So come dawn, everybody got up, and lo and behold, there's good old little HMS Newport sat right at the head of the column. Of course, the French are completely outraged by this, but they can't really do a huge amount about it without completely screwing up the day's proceedings, and so Newport becomes the first ship to complete a crossing from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. For diplomatic reasons, they had to officially reprimand Commander Nares, as I'm going to call him from now on. But unofficially, well, sticking one up to the French was generally considered a good thing in Britain. And on top of that, of course, it had made Britain look good. It made the Royal Navy look good. It had made Nares in particular very popular among the public. So unofficially, he was told, officially, we have to stick that on your record to not completely upset everybody. Unofficially, though, really good job. You've got a bright future. And for someone who just received an official letter of reprimand, he was promoted from commander to captain later in the year, which kind of tells you everything about how the Admiralty truly felt about the incident. Andrew Dederer asks, understanding the various French naval strategies of the late 19th century, clearly they are an attempt to determine how new technology was impacting traditional norms, but my question is this more a reaction to the Royal Navy simply getting too big to contemplate direct competition, or is it an attempt to outflank domestic political rivals, i.e. is their motive to beat the Royal Navy or to take over military thinking from the rather staid and somewhat disgraced post-Franco-Prussian War army? It seems that good, of course, isn't really compatible with the rapid growth of colonies in this era. Mostly it's an attempt to regain naval supremacy off of the Royal Navy. There is rivalry with the French army, but the French Navy always understands that as a European continental power, France kind of has to have an army, even if they don't necessarily cover themselves in glory in the Franco-Prussian War, but then at the same time neither really did the French Navy, so there you go. The main thing that they're facing is that France traditionally sees itself as one of the big players in naval terms and has always competed on that level, going way, way back all the way through to the beginning of cannon-armed vessels. Now, at times, they've even had a larger navy than the Royal Navy, even if they haven't been able to wield it quite as effectively. But in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and then going forward as you get the British Empire really taking hold of the planet, the British Empire's ability to construct and maintain a fleet is industrially and financially in excess of what France is capable of doing. Plus, of course, the British don't have to maintain a particularly large army, so they can devote a greater proportion of their defence spending to a navy. That gives them a couple of inherent major advantages. But the French don't necessarily like this because they want to be at least on a peer level, if not greater than the Royal Navy, to secure their own interests. But if you can't build as many big capital ships as your opponent and then maintain them, well, what do? And this is where pretty much the root cause of most of the various evolutions in French naval strategy in the latter part of the 19th century, and even to a certain extent before that. Essentially what the French are trying to leverage is a quality over quantity approach. If the Royal Navy can build a dozen ships of the line and we can only build 6, then if we make each of our 6 2.5 times as good as the British in some way, shape or form, then we still win. And this is why you see, actually for a surprising part of the 19th century, it's French naval officers and designers who are leading the charge in a lot of different technological fields, at least as far as implementation goes. They may not necessarily have been the first to invent something or to put the concept together, but they are quite often the first at actually getting such a thing in the water. And, well, at times they are also the first to come up with the idea anyway. So the French actually have a very long and mildly successful history with submarines in the 19th century, which most people don't. They're the first ones, of course, to come up with the steam-propelled battleship with La Napoleon. They're the first to get an ironclad in the water, even if Gloire isn't necessarily the world's best at that. And then once you get to tactics, you have new tactics, so quick-firing guns, torpedoes, torpedo boats, etc. And now all of a sudden they are looking very, very closely at how can we exploit these things, which seem to offer an ability to hurt much bigger ships with a much smaller, less expensive package. How can we exploit this to essentially counteract the Royal Navy? Because, of course, if, let's say, half a dozen torpedo boats can be guaranteed to sink a pre-dreadnought, if those half dozen torpedo boats cost 1/3 of a dreadnought, well, France can, if they can afford 50% of the Royal Navy budget, then France can afford more torpedo boats than they need to sink the Royal Navy's pre-dreadnought fleet, at which point France wins. Of course, at some point they then abandon that idea and they go back to the rather more conventional idea of building a battle fleet. But even then, in a video that I hopefully will have out in the next month or two, which is tentatively entitled Why French Pre-Dreadnoughts, I'm going to go into a lot more detail as to why you get all these odd features like the really long ram nose, the extreme tumble home, the guns of all sorts of weird shapes and sizes everywhere, single guns forward and aft instead of twins, and all this other stuff that make French pre-dreadnoughts look very odd and in some cases behave very oddly. But the French weren't just sticking together random ideas out of nowhere. There was a coherent doctrine behind it, but that's something that, as I said, is going to need an entire Wednesday video to explain. Sage of Irrelevance asks, I recently watched Dr. Clark's video about the Shokaku-class aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. During the video, Dr. Clark states that the Shokakus, while very capable, were in his opinion too conservative of a design for what Japan needed, that the designers pulled their punches to a certain degree. He stated that Japan needed the carrier equivalent of the Yamato class, i.e. something big and scary enough to function as a deterrent. He suggested a purpose-built carrier of the same displacement as the Lexington, so around 37,000 tons, with a 36-36-36 air group and around a dozen to 2 dozen planes in reserve, but didn't go into much more detail. Do we know whether the Japanese Navy ever designed such a carrier? And if you were in charge of Japanese carrier design in the mid-1930s, and assume you aren't a British spy, how would you design Japan's maximum aircraft carrier? Well, I don't know so much about specifically a Lexington equivalent in displacement, but the Japanese, we do know, designed what we would term an early supercarrier, as I covered in the 5-minute guide on the G14-G15 projects. So one of these is essentially kind of the Japanese version of Midway or Malta, so it's a 50,000-ton-ish armoured flight deck aircraft carrier, which is quite a substantial offering. Now, Japan could have built such things instead of the Shokakus. That's not really beyond doubt. They, after all, very shortly thereafter, and in fact on the same slipway as Shokaku, for example, would lay down Shinano. It is entirely possible that if you can build a 60 to almost 70,000 ton battleship, building a 50,000 ton aircraft carrier is not beyond the ken of men. But there would be a couple of big caveats to that. Firstly, it would be catapulting yourself rather catastrophically forward and hoping for the best, because if you delete the Shokakus from design consideration, then you have two conversions, Akagi and Kaga, which are quite big, to small carriers in Soryu and Hiryu. And so you're going, in terms of purpose-built carriers, from tiny to something 2.5 times their displacement. That's a fairly big jump to make design assumptions about. You could get away with it, but you may make 1 or 2 wrong turns here or there. So it would be a bit of, as they would say in Yes Prime Minister, a courageous decision. The other issue is that, as I mentioned, the Japanese have a limited number of large slipways. Thus, the larger problem is actually, if you build a 50,000+ ton carrier instead of the Shokakus, the build time on the slipway is going to be extended. So what are you delaying instead? What is not being built because your 2 carriers are on the slipways for a bit longer? That may not be a massive issue because, as we said, after Shokaku came Shinano, and, well, that didn't really work out very well for anyone and wasn't really going to make a huge impact on the war. But, of course, the Japanese don't know that when they're planning these things. So one of the bigger reasons why they might not want to spend so much time building such a large aircraft carrier is because they might think it's going to compromise their timeline of building other things like really big battleships. But in terms of if I was going to design a Japanese supercarrier, the G14 design is serviceable enough. I might be tempted to stick another lift in there somewhere and, of course, massively improve the ventilation system so the thing doesn't turn itself into a gigantic Taiho-style fuel air bomb. But it's a very good place to start from. Now, of course, the other thing is that, as Midway would discover, and indeed even the Essexes to a certain degree, you can't really operate much more than 100 aircraft at a time without everything going completely silly. The Japanese might have a little bit of a path around that, in as much as obviously the Japanese doctrine running up to the beginning of World War II doesn't involve launching every aircraft on the carrier at once. It involves launching a more limited strike package, which joins up with other strike packages from other carriers to form one big attack wave. So they could potentially get away with actually operating considerably more aircraft, because then you would, with all the other ships, you'd launch your first big wave, then you'd launch your next big wave, and then with the other carriers with limited capacity, they would have to recover their first waves before launching a third wave, whereas this theoretical Japanese supercarrier could, at least if there's two of them, launch a third wave entirely on their own. Now, that wave won't be as large. It'd be maybe 60, 70 aircraft as opposed to 120 plus. But if you've hit your enemy with 120 plus aircraft twice over, and they're still twitching, well, 60 to 70 aircraft is either going to finish them off, or if it's not going to finish them off, your first 250 odd aircraft did something horribly wrong. Or, of course, alternatively, you could just have tons of reserve aircraft, but that also means you'll need a lot of reserve pilots, and that goes back into, are you going to upgrade the Japanese naval aviation schools to actually produce a reasonable number of trained aircrew? And I think that's really what it comes down to. Yes, they would obviously be very durable, but at the end of the day, when you look at the end of 1942, Japan had a carrier advantage, quite a significant one actually, over the US Navy. Granted, not all of the Japanese carriers that were around were in particularly good shape, and this is where the armoured flight decks of these supercarriers would probably help, but their much, much larger problem was they near enough expended their frontline cadres of trained pilots. So while these ships would make 1942 a considerably harder thing for the Allies, at the end of the day they are going to be ground down by shortages of properly trained aircrew, even if the ships themselves take a lot of a beating. And that kind of loops back round to, if you're going to change just one thing to give the Japanese a better chance of holding out a little bit longer in World War II, really you have to address the Naval Aviation School rather than particular ships. Although, as I've said before with these kinds of questions, all that means is Japan gets hit by more nukes, so not necessarily the wisest thing to do. And that just about wraps us up for part 1 of Drydock episode 308. Thanks for listening, and, well, see you in Drydock 308 part 2.